Welcome back to Harry's Verse, where the stories never play it safe. Today's adventure: what if Harry Potter was betrayed by everyone he trusted and returned to rule them all? Before we dive in, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Clean up the morning. The prophet ran his face under the word dangerous. Harry Potter read it standing up in the Auror lift and decided he had time for tea. He did not finish the article. He had read enough of Rita Skeeter to know how she built a sentence, as she said a true fact and a false implication side by side and let the reader marry them. The photograph was 3 years old. In it he was raising his wand at something off frame, jaw lit by a curse that had since become a footnote in a war nobody wanted to discuss in daylight. The caption asked whether the wizarding world had traded one strongman for another. The byline did not ask anything. It never did. It only counted the dead and assigned them to him. The lift opened on level 2. He folded the paper, tucked it under his arm, and went to work. The Auror office had changed in the 2 years since the war. The desks were the same and the memos still flew themselves in lazy purple loops to the ceiling, but the men and women under them had learned a new posture. They sat straighter when the lift chimed. They watched the doors. Victory had a smell at first, bright and metallic, and then it had gone over into something else, the smell of a thing kept too long in a sealed room. People had stopped being afraid of Death Eaters. They had started being afraid of the people who had killed Death Eaters. Harry passed Williamson, who nodded. He passed Savage, who did not. At the end of the row, a stack of gray folders sat squared against the corner of his desk, and Robards' handwriting marched across the top one in the small capitals the head Auror used when he wanted a thing understood and did not want to say it aloud. SELWIN, priority, raid authorized, see me. Robards' office had a window that looked at nothing, a charmed pane that showed whether the ministry's lower bureaucracy had decided London ought to have that day. Today it showed rain. Robards stood with his back to it, which meant he had already decided something and wanted Harry to talk him out of nothing. You've seen the paper, Robards said. I've seen the photograph. It's the third this month. It's the same one they ran in May. They've cropped Dawlish out of the left side. He was the one who actually cast first that day. Robards did not smile. He had a soldier's face, weathered into neutrality, and he kept it neutral now. Selwyn-'s been seen in the fens. The old estate Cotter Mire, the bit that didn't burn in 98. We've got a family in the village that's gone quiet. We've got an owl that went out and didn't come back. I want him before the prophet decides we're sitting on our hands while purebloods regroup. You want me, Harry said. I want this clean. You're the cleanest I have. It was almost a compliment, and Robards almost meant it, and they both knew that cleanliness was no longer a thing measured by the work. It was measured by the paper afterward. Harry had learned to read these conversations as he read a dueling stance by where the weight sat. The weight sat on Selwyn. It would not stay there. Who's my team? Weasley, Proudfoot, 2 from the hit Wizards for the cordon. Robards turned at last and looked at him. Take Weasley's lead on the wards. He's read up. He's been wanting a command piece. Harry kept his face the way the office had taught everyone to keep their faces. Ron had been wanting a great many things lately, and the wanting had developed an edge that scraped when they were alone and dulled politely whenever a third person came into the room. Harry had not decided yet whether the edge was meant for him or for the world in general. He had been too tired to decide. Tiredness had become the medium he moved through, thick and constant, the residue of a war that had ended on parchment and refused to end anywhere else. Fine, he said. Potter. Robards' voice followed him to the door. Bring him in alive if you can. The Wisengamot likes a trial these days, gives them something to be merciful about. Harry went out into the rain that was not weather. They assembled in the staging room at 4 while the fens were still dark and the charm light along the ceiling buzzed at the low frequency that meant the ministry was economizing. Proudfoot had brought maps. The 2 hit wizards had brought the particular silence of men paid not to ask questions. Ron came in last, robes already on, wand already in hand, and set a roll of ward schematics on the table with the air of someone laying down a winning card. Cotter Mire, he said. I went over the survey last night. The east wing's sound. West wing took curse damage in the war. The stone S degraded. It won't hold a fight, so we don't fight in the west wing. We push him east into the gallery and we cordon there. It was good work. That was the thing Harry would remember later, turning it over in the dark of a cell. It had been good work and Ron had done it, and there had been a moment in the staging room when Harry had felt something close to the old thing between them. The 2 of them bent over a problem with the world narrowed to its edges. Stabilizers, Harry said. Degraded stone fighting nearby. We anchor it or it comes down. 4 corner runes, Ron said. Standard collapse frame. I'll take south and west, you take the gallery. Proudfoot anchors north. We light them on the way in. Households, we keep the fight clean. Selwyn's got nowhere to drop a wall on us. Who's in the house? A pause, small, the length of a breath, and Harry noticed it as he noticed everything that year, automatically and without yet knowing what to do with what he noticed. Selwyn, Ron said, maybe a couple of his lot. Survey didn't show life signs in the cellar, but the wards down there are old. They scatter the reading. So we don't know. So we assume hostile and we keep the wing standing, Ron said, which is the whole point of the stabilizers, mate. He grinned when he said it, the grin that had once been the easiest thing in Harry's life and had lately become a tool he used, and Proudfoot laughed and the room loosened and they went. The Selwyn estate sat in the mire like something that had drowned and been only partly recovered. The east wing rose out of the reeds with its windows dark. The west wing was a ruin of teeth. Between them the great hall slumped under a roof that had given up in places, and over it all lay the particular stillness of a warded structure, the air gone flat and listening. They came in on foot across the causeway because apparition wards laced the grounds and Harry would not risk splinching a man into a bog to save 4 minutes. The hit wizards peeled off to the cordon. Proudfoot went north along the wall, wand low, and at the corner of the north range his stabilizer rune flared and sank into the stone, and the air there tightened with the sound of a held note. Harry felt it through the soles of his boots, the way a good ward announced itself, a pressure behind the teeth. North S up, Proudfoot said into the calm charm. Harry went to the gallery door. The lock was a child's problem and he left it locked because the lock told him the door had not been used, and laid the gallery stabilizer into the threshold stone himself. It took. The note climbed by 1, 2 corners holding. He waited for the third and the fourth. South, he said, static. Weasley, south and west. Working on it, Ron's voice flat through the charm. West rune S not biting. Stone's worse than the survey said. Then anchor south and we hold 3 corners and we do not fight near the west wing. Confirm south. A pause. The note in the stone did not climb. Harry had stood in a great many rooms while the floor moved under his certainties, and he had learned that the body knew first, his knew now. The stillness of the house had a hole in it where a rune should have been singing, and into that hole faintly came the sound he had been told would not be there, a child crying somewhere below, muffled through old stone and older wards. Cellars occupied, Harry said. Confirm south rune now and abort the push. We evacuate the cellar first, the west wing lit. It was not Selwyn's plan and it was not Harry's. It was simply what happened when a cornered man with a wand and nothing left to lose found a structure already half dead and decided to take the room with him. Fire came out of the west wing in a sheet, not fiendfear. Selwyn had never been that good, but a blasting curse chained off a gas pocket in the rotted timber, and the bad stone that should have been held by a south rune and a west rune did what bad stone does when no one is holding it. The west wing came down. The sound of it went through Harry's chest like a fist. Dust climbed the dark in a column and the floor under the gallery jumped, and through the calm charm Proudfoot was shouting that north was buckling, and the crying in the cellar stopped, which was worse than the crying. Harry moved. He did not think about Selwyn until Selwyn was in front of him, which was the kind of mistake the office trained out of you and the war trained back in. The corridor between the gallery and the collapsing hall filled with smoke, and Selwyn came through it the way a drowning man comes up, wild wand swinging, a curse already leaving it the color of a bruise. Harry read the stance and the weight and the wand line in the quarter-second the smoke allowed and understood 3 things at once. Selwyn meant to kill him. Selwyn would not stop while he breathed. And behind Selwyn, past the buckling arch, the fire had found the eastern timbers and was walking toward the cellar stair where the crying had been. There was a version of the next second that the Auror office's procedure manual would have approved. Disarm, bind, restrain, read the suspect his statutes. It assumed 2 duelists in a stable room and time, and Harry had none of those things, and the manual had been written by men who had never had to choose between a clean arrest and a child under a burning floor. He chose, he cast once. It was not a curse the manual liked. It was old and exact, and it did one thing well, and it did that thing to Selwyn between one stride and the next, and Selwyn folded into the smoke without finishing the word he had started. Harry was already past him before the body settled. He took the cellar stair 4 at a time through heat that pulled the breath out of him, and he found the door, and he tore it open with a spell that left his hand ringing, and he got them out. There were 4 of them. A village family, the man and woman who had gone quiet, and 2 children, and the children were alive, and that was the part that mattered and the part that would matter least to anyone who counted it later. He carried the smaller one up the stair himself with his cloak over both their heads against the falling fire, and Proudfoot got the others, and they came out into the reeds as the great hall folded in behind them with a sound like the world clearing its throat. When the dust settled, 4 people stood in the mire who would otherwise have died, and 1 man lay in the rubble who had meant to kill a child to spite the world, and the east wing burned itself out against the wet dark, and Harry knelt in the reeds with a coughing 4-year-old against his chest and felt, for the length of a breath, that the work had been worth doing. Then he saw Ron's face, and he understood that the work was about to stop being the thing that anyone discussed. Ron had come around the ruin of the west wing with his wand still lit and his ward schematics nowhere in evidence. He looked at the family in the reeds. He looked at the column of smoke where the hall had been. He looked at Harry, and what crossed his face was not relief and not horror but a quick private arithmetic, the look of a man counting a sum and not liking the figure and deciding very fast who would be made to carry it. "Tell me you didn't kill him," Ron said. "He'd have killed the child." "Tell me you didn't use that curse." Harry stood. The 4-year-old's mother took her from him with hands that shook and said something he did not hear. "Thank you maybe, and it would not be in any account that followed." "South rune," Harry said. "You never anchored it. West rune wouldn't bite. You heard me say it. You had time for south, 3 corners and a clean push. That was the plan, that was your plan, and you anchored 1 corner and the hall came down on a cellar you told me was empty." Ron's jaw worked. Behind him, Proudfoot was very carefully looking at the smoke. The hit wizards had arrived at the causeway and stopped there, and they too were looking at the smoke, and Harry understood with the slow certainty of a man reading a verdict, in a stance, that he was the only person in the mire who would tell this story the way it had happened, and that he would be telling it alone. "You killed a man and brought a house down with civilians in it," Ron said, and his voice had found a register Harry had never heard him use, public, rehearsed, a thing he had been keeping in a drawer. "That's what happened here, Harry, that's what I saw. The inquiry took 9 days. Harry spent them mostly at his desk because no one had told him not to, which was its own kind of answer. The gray folders kept coming. People kept their faces. Robard stopped meeting his eyes in the corridor, and then stopped being in the corridor when Harry was, and the charmed window in his office showed rain every day that week, which Harry decided meant nothing and noticed anyway. The prophet ran the photograph again. This time they had a name for the curse. They had 3 experts on magical law who had never seen Harry cast anything explaining at length what the curse did to a human body, and a diagram, and a quote from an unnamed source within the Auror office describing a pattern of escalating force. They had a photograph of the Selwyn ruin with a caption that did not mention the 4 people in the reeds, because the 4 people in the reeds had been escorted home by the ministry and asked, with great courtesy, to let the ministry handle the public side of things, and the ministry had handled it by removing them from the story. On the 4th day, a memo found his desk that did not loop or flap. It folded itself once formally and lay flat, and it bore the seal of the Minister for Magic, and it requested his presence at 6:30, after the office had emptied, by a door that did not appear on the public floor plan. Kingsley Shacklebolt private office was warm in a way the rest of the ministry had forgotten how to be, paneled in old wood, lit by a fire that burned a little too steadily to be ordinary. Kingsley stood by it with a glass he did not offer to share. He had aged into the chair he occupied, the deep voice grown careful, the easy size of him gone watchful. He had been once a man who slept in safe houses with Harry and took watches and shared the bottom of a kettle. He gestured Harry to a seat and remained standing, which told Harry the shape of the conversation before either of them had spoken. "I read the real file," Kingsley said. "I want you to know that. I read it, the South Rune, all of it. I know what happened in that mire." "Then you know what to do about it." "I know what I would do if the world were the one we fought for." Kingsley turned the glass. "It is. We won the war and lost the country to its own nerves. Do you know what crosses my desk now? Not Death Eaters, petitions, villages that want their wands registered because registration feels like safety, mothers who write to ask whether the man who beat the Dark Lord can be made to live somewhere they aren't. Half the Wisengamot got their seats this spring by promising to do something about you, and I am minister by a margin of 9 votes, and every one of those 9 voted because I did not stand too close to you in public. So you won't stand close to me now. I am telling you the arithmetic," Kingsley said, "because I respect you enough not to lie about it. If I defend you, I fall, and the man who replaces me is Yaxley's cousin in everything but the name, and he will not give you a white room and a trial. He will give you a cell and a dementor and a paragraph in the prophet. I can hold the door open to fair hearing. I cannot hold the door open to your innocence. There isn't a version of this where you walk out clean and I survive it, and a minister who has fallen helps no one, least of all you." It was, Harry thought, the most honest betrayal of the week, and the worst, because Kingsley was not lying and was not cruel and had done the sum correctly and arrived at the conclusion that Harry Potter was a cost the government could afford and the alternative was not. There was no rune he had failed to anchor, no testimony he had practiced in a mirror. He had simply weighed a friend against a chair and found the chair heavier, and he had the decency to say so to the friend's face, and the decency made it unforgivable in a way that Ron's lie had not quite managed. "You're sacrificing me to keep your seat," Harry said, "and you've come to make sure I understand it isn't personal. I've come to tell you to take whatever they offer." Kingsley met his eyes. "Granger's framework, the binding, take it, live. Small for a few years and let the country forget to be afraid of you and then have whatever life is left. That is the most I can do, and I am doing it at a risk I will not describe to you, and you will never thank me for it, and I have made my peace with that." Harry stood. The fire burned its too steady burn. "You used to take the first watch," he said, "so the rest of us could sleep. I remember that. I want you to know I remember it." He went to the hidden door. "I won't be small, Kingsley. I tried being small for 2 years. It's how I ended up here." Hermione came to see him on the 5th day. She came at lunch when the office emptied, which he understood later was deliberate, and she sat in the chair across his desk as she had sat in 100 chairs across 100 tables. And for a moment the years folded, and she was the girl who had pulled him through every impossible thing by the sheer refusal to let the world be as bad as it was. "I've read the casework," she said, "all of it. The real file, not the prophet. And you killed him, Harry. You used a curse that isn't on the sanction list, and a man died, and there were civilians in the structure. There were 4 people in a cellar Ron told me was empty," Harry said. "There are 4 people alive tonight because I killed him instead of arresting him. That's the casework. That's what's in the real file if anyone reads it." Hermione had brought parchment. She set it on the desk between them, squared it, and did not look at it, which was how he knew she had already decided what was on it before she came. "It isn't about that night anymore," she said. "It hasn't been about that night since the 2nd day. It's about you. It's about the fact that you can do things no one can check, that there's no one in the Auror office who could stop you if you decided not to be stopped, and the entire structure of magical law assumes that everyone can be stopped. You're a hole in the structure." "I'm a hole in the structure," he repeated. "I'm trying to help you." Her voice climbed, the old urgency, and for a moment he almost believed it was the old urgency. "There are people in the Wisengamot who want you in Azkaban. There are people who want worse. I'm trying to find a version of this that you survive, and the only version I can find is one where you let them put limits on you, where you agree to be containable, because a Harry Potter who can be contained is a Harry Potter they don't have to destroy." He looked at the parchment. He did not pick it up. He had read enough of Rita Skeeter to know how a true fact and a false implication could be married on a page, and he saw now that Hermione had learned the same craft and had told herself it was kindness. You wrote a framework, he said. I wrote a framework. For containing me, for saving your life. She said it as she said things she had proved. If you stand in front of the Wisengamot as a man who refuses any limit, they will read that as a threat, and they will be right to. If you stand there as a man willing to be bound, you give the moderates something to vote for. I've counted the votes, Harry. I've done the work. This is the only door that doesn't end with you dead or in a cell. I'm asking you to walk through it before someone shoves you through a worse one. There was a version of Hermione who would have set fire to the Wisengamot before she let it bind a friend. He had known her. He looked for her now across the desk and found instead a woman who had counted the votes, who had built a containment out of love and law and the unbearable practicality of someone who could not stand to lose, and who had decided that the way to keep from losing him was to break him into a shape the world would tolerate. Get out, Hermione, he said without heat because the heat had gone somewhere he could not reach it. Take your framework, go count your votes. She left the parchment. He did not read it that day. He read it later in the dark when reading it could no longer cost him anything, and found that she had been telling the truth about every part of it except the part that mattered, which was that she had stopped believing he was a person and started believing he was a problem, and had built him a cage and called it a door. On the seventh day, while he still could, he went to see Teddy. No one had forbidden it. That was the texture of those days. No one forbade anything, because forbidding would have meant admitting that the verdict was already written, and the ministry preferred to let him walk around inside a sentence that had not officially been passed. He took the flue to Andromeda Tonks's cottage on the edge of a Devon moor, where the wards were her own work, and recognized him and let him through without the flat, listening pressure of the ministry. Teddy was 4 and changing his hair the way other children change their minds, and when Harry came out of the grate the head went from mouse brown to a violent, delighted green, and a body launched itself across the rug and attached to his leg, and for the length of that contact the white room and the counted votes and the floor Ginny had studied all went somewhere they could not reach him. He picked his godson up. Teddy put both hands flat on Harry's face as he did when he wanted to be sure of something, and announced that he had made a frog, and the frog was in a jar, and the frog's name was also Harry, and the situation regarding the 2 Harrys would need to be explained at length. Andromeda watched from the kitchen door, drying her hands on a cloth, with the particular stillness of a woman who had buried a husband and a daughter and a son-in-law inside 2 years and had no stillness left over for being surprised by anything. You've seen the paper, she said, when the frog had been visited in the second Harry duly admired. Everyone keeps saying that. I buried Nymphadora, Andromeda said, for that ministry. I buried Ted because the same machine that's writing your name in the prophet decided Muggle-borns were a category before it decided they were people. Don't look at me as though I'll be shocked, Harry. I'm the least shockable woman in Britain. She set down the cloth. They're going to bind you. They're going to try. Sit down. You'll frighten the child standing there like a man at his own graveside. She put tea in front of him that he did not drink and sat across the small table with Teddy installed in her lap, and she looked at him with eyes that had Sirius's directness and none of his recklessness. I'm not going to tell you to run. You won't. You're too proud and too stubborn, and you've decided to make them do it where people can see. I'm going to tell you something you'll need later when you've stopped being able to hear it from anyone who loves you, because by then there won't be many. Go on. This world breaks the people who carry it. She said it without weight, as she'd say the kettle had boiled. It broke my husband and my daughter, and it's been breaking you since you were a baby on my sister's doorstep. It takes everything you'll give, and it calls the giving your duty, and the day you've nothing left to give it writes dangerous over your face and wonders aloud whether it was ever safe to keep you. I watched it do this to better loved people than you. The only ones it doesn't break are the ones who stop letting it decide what they are. She brushed green hair out of Teddy's eyes. You've a godson. Whatever you become after they do this to you, you become it as his. Remember that there was a table in Devon where nobody wanted anything from you. It'll matter on the far side of wherever you're going. Harry looked at the child in her lap, who had gone heavy and drowsy, and was telling the frog Harry a long confidential story about the other Harry. And he understood that Andromeda had just handed him the only thing anyone in his life had offered all week that was not a cage or an apology or an arithmetic. He took Teddy's hand for a moment, the whole fist of it folding around 2 of his fingers, and he made a promise in the privacy of his own chest that he would keep through everything that followed, and that would, more than once, be the only line he did not cross. I'll be back, he told the child, who was asleep. No, Andromeda said, not unkindly, walking him to the grate. You won't be back as this. Go and become whatever lets you keep that promise. We'll be here. The arrest came at Grimmauld Place at night in the rain that was real this time and fell on the square outside the way real rain does, indifferently. He knew they were coming before the knock. The house knew. Number 12 had been many things across its long, foul history, and it had learned to feel a crowd assembling on the step, and it passed the knowledge to him through the floor and the old portraits, who had gone quiet, even Walburga, who only went quiet for one thing. He sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of tea and his wand on the table where they could see he had not raised it, because he had thought about this, about how it would be told, and he had decided that whatever else they took from him tonight, they would not take the line that he had come quietly. Creature stood at his elbow, vibrating with a fury too large for his frame. Master should run, the elf hissed. Creature will take Master through the elf roads they cannot follow, they are not worthy to follow. No, Harry said. If I run, the story they're telling becomes true. Stay near Andromeda, stay near Teddy, do as I asked. The knock, when it came, was ministry formal, 3 raps and a pause and a writ read through the door by a voice he half knew, some functionary from magical law who would tell his grandchildren about tonight. Harry let them read it. He let them break the wards he had deliberately left thin, because wards that fought would be wards that hurt someone, and he had killed his last man for the year. The kitchen filled with Aurors he had trained beside. Some of them would not look at him. One of them, young Hopkirk's nephew, looked at him the entire time with the open white face of someone watching a thing he had been told was a monster behave exactly like a tired man at a kitchen table. Ron came in behind them. He had not come to make the arrest, he had come to be seen making it, which Harry understood was the future of every interaction they would ever have again. He stood by the dresser with his hand near his wand and his eyes on the middle distance and said nothing, and his silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing in it. Hermione did not come. He noted the absence and understood it. She had done her part on parchment. She did not need to be in the room. She had already counted the votes. And Ginny. Ginny came last in the doorway in her traveling cloak with the harpy's crest still pinned at the throat because she had come straight from somewhere public, and she stood in the door of the house where they had once planned to be ordinary, and she looked at him across the heads of the men who had come to take him. He waited. He did not say her name. He had decided somewhere in the 9 days that he would not be the one to speak, that he would let every person in his life choose in front of him in the open what they were, and he would carry the knowledge of it out of the room intact. She had a thing she could have said. He knew the shape of it. She could have said that the South Room was Ron's, that she had heard Ron say so himself in the Burrows' kitchen before the prophet got to him, that her brother was lying and her family was letting him. She had the words, and she had the standing, and she had the audience, and the cost of using them would have been the Weasley name, the easy public love of a country that had decided which Weasley to believe, the whole bright, ordinary life that had survived the war when so little else had. She looked at him and her mouth opened, and the functionary from magical law said, "Mr. Potter, if you'll stand." And the moment that Ginny might have spoken and went past like a train through a station, and she closed her mouth and she looked at the floor. That was all. That was the whole of it. He had imagined betrayal in the 9 days as a thing with a sound, a slammed door, a shouted accusation, a curse in the back. It was none of those. It was a woman he loved looking at the floor of a kitchen, while men he had bled beside led him out into rain that was, for once, only rain. He stood when he was told to stand. He held out his wrists when the binding cords came. Holly wand surrendered into a ministry box that closed over it with a sound he would hear in his sleep for 3 years. He walked between the Aurors to the door, and at the door he stopped because Ron was there by the dresser, and Harry had decided he would let everyone choose, and Ron had not yet had to choose to his face. "South Room," Harry said, quietly, for the room. Ron's hand twitched toward his wand and did not reach it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, and his voice was steady, and that steadiness was the most damning thing Harry had heard all week, because it meant Ron had practiced, that he had stood somewhere private and rehearsed not knowing, and the practice had taken. Harry looked at him for as long as the Aurors would allow, which was not long, and he found that he had nothing further to say, that the years between them had emptied out into this kitchen and left only a man by a dresser pretending not to understand a sentence about a rune. He went out into the square. The rain found his face. Behind him, number 12, Grimmauld Place watched its last Black, last Potter, last anything walk down the wet steps between his keepers, and for once in its bitter life the house had the decency to be silent. They side-alonged him from the square because his own apparition was bound. The last thing he saw of the street where he had thought he might live an ordinary life was the lit kitchen window, gold in the rain, and Ginny's silhouette in it, still looking at the floor. They held him in a ministry cell, not Azkaban, not yet, in a white room below the courts that had been built for exactly this, for keeping a dangerous thing comfortable enough that no one could complain about its keeping. There was a bed and a chair and a window charm that showed, in a cruelty he was sure no one had intended, a field under a clean sky. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair and went over it, not the curse and not the collapse, which were facts and would not change, but the people, who were also facts now and would also not change. He laid them out as he laid out a dueling line by where the weight sat. Ron, who had wanted things, and had found that the simplest way to get them was to let Harry fall and stand on the place where he had been. Hermione, who had loved him into a cage because she could not love him out of danger, who had decided that the moral weight of saving his life entitled her to redesign it. Kingsley, who had not come a second time and would not, who would let the courts do what the courts did because a minister who protected Harry Potter would not be minister by autumn. Ginny, who had looked at the floor. And under all of them, holding them up, the structure Hermione had named so precisely that he almost admired it. A world that had used him as a weapon for 17 years and discovered, the moment the war was won, that it did not know how to live with a weapon that had a will. They had loved him while he was pointed at their enemies. They had loved him exactly that long. He found, sitting in the white room, that he was not angry in as he had expected to be angry. The anger was there. It sat in his chest like a swallowed coal, banked and patient. But over the top of it had come something quieter and more useful, a clarity he had not had in 2 years, since the war ended and the tiredness had closed over him. The tiredness was gone. It had been the tiredness of a man trying to be what they wanted, trying to be the good soldier who put down his weapon and let them paint the fence around him, and now that they had taken even that from him, there was nothing left to be tired for. He understood in the White Room with great calm that he had spent his whole life being saved for other people's purposes and spent for them, and that the saving and the spending had this in common. In neither case had anyone asked him what he wanted. He found to be done, not done forgiving, though he was that too, done being the kind of thing they could do this to. Done living in a world arranged so that the people who gave everything ended in white rooms while the people who counted the votes slept well. He turned the wand over in the dark and found it had edges, and that the edges were useful, and that he was looking at last at a problem he actually intended to solve. They had broken something in him that night in the kitchen. He sat with the breakage, and he did not flinch from it. And somewhere under the break, in the place the coal sat banked and waiting, an old allegiance he had never asked for and never understood stirred and took notice, the way deep water notices a stone, and recognized in the wronged and emptied thing in the chair its master coming at last into his inheritance. Harry did not know that yet. He only knew that he was awake and clear and finished with being good in the way they had defined good. He sat in the chair and watched the false field under the false sky and waited for the trial they were so pleased to be giving him, and began without hurry to plan. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The binding. They brought him up for the trial through a crowd which someone had arranged because a crowd was useful. The visitor's entrance to the ministry led out onto a muggle street that had been quietly cleared for the morning, and along the cleared pavement stood several hundred witches and wizards who had learned somehow the hour the prisoner would arrive, and who had come to be present at it. They were not most of them cruel people. Harry could see that even through the cordon, even with two unspeakables hands on his arms. They were ordinary, frightened, decent in the small ways that ordinary, frightened people are decent, and they had been told for 2 years by paper they trusted that the war was not truly over while one particular man walked free with one particular set of abilities, and they had come to watch the war finish at last. A few shouted. Most only watched, which was worse, the silent civic attention of a society witnessing a thing it has agreed to need. He walked the cleared pavement between his keepers and did not give the crowd a face to remember. He had thought about this in the cell. A defiant face would print as a threat and confirm them. A broken face would print as justice and satisfy them. He gave them neither. He gave them a man walking, unhurried, looking at the ordinary morning sky over an ordinary street as though he had somewhere to be and the appointment was tedious, and the lack of anything to photograph unsettled the front rank in a manner he found instructive. People who have come to watch a monster do not know where to put their hands when the monster declines to perform. A woman near the cordon was holding a child up to see, the way you hold a child up for a parade, and the child, who was perhaps 6 and understood none of it, waved. Harry inclined his head to the child gravely as one professional to another, and somewhere behind the gesture the mother went pale and pulled the small arm down, and Harry walked on, and that he thought was the entire transaction of the morning in miniature. A child who did not yet know to be afraid, and the hand that taught it. They took him down through the atrium, where the golden fountain had been rebuilt after the war with new figures. A witch and wizard and a goblin and a centaur and a house elf arranged in noble cooperation. A monument to a unity that had lasted exactly as long as the threat that produced it. He looked at the goblin's golden face as he passed, and the goblin's golden face looked at nothing, and he thought about the vault they were going to sequester today, and about whose ground that reached into, and he kept the thought because it was the kind of thought that would be useful later, when there was a later. The lifts took him down past the courts to courtroom 10, and the doors of the lift opened on the stone throat of the place, and the morning and the crowd and the child's wave fell away behind him, and there was only the descent and the chair and the chains that lay slack until an accused man sat in them. They tried him in courtroom 10, which was the room they kept for things they wanted to feel ancient. It sat at the bottom of the ministry like a stone throat, tiers of benches climbing into a dark that the torches never finished, and at the center of the floor a single chair with chains that lay slack until an accused man sat in them. Harry had stood in this room before at 15 while a different government decided whether he had earned the right to defend his own life. He remembered the chains had not moved that day. They moved now. They came up around his wrists the moment he sat, links sliding over each other with a sound like a dropped purse of coins, and he let them because a man who fought the chair gave the room the picture it wanted, and he had decided long ago what pictures he would and would not give. The Wisengamot filled the benches in their plum robes. He counted them without seeming to. He had spent the cell days reconstructing the chamber from memory, seat by seat, name by name, the ones Hermione had counted and the ones she had not bothered with, and he laid the live room over the remembered one and looked for the differences. There were fewer empty seats than he had expected. People had come to watch. The chief warlock was a man named Aldous Crane, who had taken the gavel 8 months earlier on a platform of restoring confidence, which in the language of that year meant doing something visible about the things people were afraid of. He had a long, mild face and the unhurried manner of someone who had never personally been in a fight and considered this a qualification. He looked down at Harry over half-moon spectacles that were not Dumbledore's and that he wore, Harry thought, because they reminded the room of someone who was. Harry James Potter, Crane said, and the chamber settled. You are brought before this body on charges arising from the events at the Selwyn estate, Cawdor Mire. You are further the subject of a petition under the dangerous magical person's provision passed by this body in the spring, concerning the threat your continued liberty is held to pose. We will hear the matter of the knight first and the matter of your person second. He folded his hands. Do you understand the charges? I understand them, Harry said. Then we begin. They began with the dead. A clerk read the names of the 4 people who had died at Auror Mire, and the room held its breath in the practiced way of rooms that have learned grief makes a good overture. The 4 names belonged to a wizarding family who had been sheltering in the village. The clerk said, taken hostage by the fugitive Selwyn, and the chamber received this and was moved by it. And not one bench among the plum-robed tiers had been told, or would be told, that there had also been 4 people in the cellar who walked out of the mire alive because Harry Potter had killed a man instead of arresting him. Those 4 had been given new lodgings in a town that did not appear on the writ and a small pension for their cooperation. And the ministry called that protection, and Harry called it editing, and neither of them said so aloud. Rita Skeeter was not permitted to testify, being a journalist and not a witness, but her account was permitted to be entered, because a member of the Wisengamot had thoughtfully had it printed and circulated to the benches before the session, and so her sentences had reached the room before any sworn word did. Harry watched the effect of that and understood it for the elegant thing it was. By the time a witness rose to swear an oath, the chamber already had the shape of the story in its head, and a sworn account that fit the shape went down easily, and a sworn account that fought it sounded like special pleading. The curse came next. They had found a specialist, a healer-turned-academic named V. Holes, who lectured on the magical legal classification of injury, and V. Holes stood in the well of the court with a diagram that floated and rotated and described, in the bloodless vocabulary of his profession, what the curse Harry had used did to the human body. He used the proper name for it, which Harry had not spoken aloud in years, and the name moved through the benches like a draft. He explained that it was not among the spells sanctioned for Auror use. He explained that its effect was, in every case studied, terminal. He did not explain, because no one asked, that it was also instantaneous and clean, and stopped a man in the half-second before that man finished a curse of his own over a stairwell full of children, because that was not the question the court had convened to answer. In your professional assessment, Crane said, is this a curse a man uses when he wishes to subdue an opponent? No, said V. Holes. It is a curse a man uses when he wishes an opponent to cease. Thank you, said Crane. Harry sat in the chains and let the assessment stand because it was, as far as it went, true. He had wished Selwyn to cease. Selwyn had been mid-incantation over a stairwell, and Harry had wished him to cease before he finished, and V. Holes's diagram rotated in the air and did not contain a stairwell or a 4-year-old, and there was no version of the answer that helped, so Harry gave none. Then they called Ron. He came in his good robes, Auror insignia at the collar, and he took the witness chair with the unhappy dignity of a man performing a duty he would have given anything to be spared, and the performance was so complete that for a moment Harry almost believed it. Ron did not look at the chair in the center of the floor. He had practiced that too. Auror Weasley, Crane said, you were present at Auror Mire. You were responsible by the operational plan for the southern and western corner runes of a structural stabilization frame. Is that correct? It is. Tell the court what happened to those runes. Ron told the court. He told it well, which was the thing Harry would carry out of the room more than any other, the simple competence of the lie. He said the western rune had failed to take, that the stone was too degraded, that he had reported this over the comcharm, all of which was true and all of which Harry had heard with his own ears. And then in the place where the truth had a south rune that Ron had never anchored though he had time and stone enough, Ron put a silence, and into the silence the chamber poured its own conclusion. He did not say he had failed to set the south rune. He said the frame had failed. He let the room believe the frame had failed because the building was old and the war had ruined it, and these things were nobody's fault. And the room, which wanted a story with a monster in it and not a story with an exhausted civil service and a difficult night, took the gift and laid the collapse at the foot of the chair in the center of the floor. And Mr. Potter's conduct, Crane said. In your assessment as a fellow Auror, was it within the bounds of the operation? Harry did what Harry does, Ron said, and there it was, the sentence he had built the whole testimony to deliver, easy and sorrowful and damning. He made a decision no one else would have made, and he made it alone, and a man died and a house came down. He's brilliant. I've said it for years and I'll say it now, but there's no one left who can tell him no, and a night comes when somebody should have. It was, Harry thought, a beautiful piece of work. It conceded brilliance to make the warning sound reluctant. It mourned, it positioned Ron as the friend who loved Harry enough to tell the hard truth, and it would read in the prophet as exactly that, and somewhere in the country a younger Ron who had followed Harry into a chamber after a basilisk would have wept to hear it. Thank you, Auror Weasley, said Crane. You may step down. Ron stepped down. He walked the length of the floor to leave, which meant he passed within 3 feet of the chair, and for that single passage the practiced distance failed him, and he looked, and Harry was looking back, and whatever Ron had rehearsed for that moment deserted him and left only a man who could not hold the eyes of the person he had just finished burying. Ron looked away first. He always would now. That was settled in the floor of courtroom 10 and would never come unsettled, and both of them knew it, and only one of them would be able to sleep. They called Ginny in the afternoon. She had not asked to be called. Harry understood that much from the set of her shoulders as she took the chair, from the fact that she came in her plain robes and not the harpy's colors, that someone had decided her testimony would be useful, and she had not found a way to refuse without the refusal itself becoming a story. She sat where Ron had sat. She did look at the chair in the center of the floor. She looked at it the whole time, which cost her something, and Harry gave her that much in the private ledger he was keeping. She looked. Miss Weasley, Crane said, you were until recently betrothed to the accused. I was. You knew him as well as anyone living. Better than most, she said. Then the court would value your assessment. Is Harry Potter a danger? The chamber waited. Harry waited. He had told himself in the cell that he expected nothing, and he had been honest with himself about the lie inside that, which was that a part of him, the part that had stood in a kitchen and watched her study the floor, was waiting still against all sense for her to say the sentence she had refused to say that night. The South Rune was Ron's. I heard him say it. My brother is lying, and you are letting him. Harry Potter, Ginny said, is the bravest person I have ever known and the loneliest, and you have all spent 2 years making certain he stayed both. She looked up at the benches, and her voice did not climb, and that flat steadiness was worse than shouting. You want me to tell you whether he's dangerous? He spent his childhood being dangerous on your behalf. He was dangerous at 11 and at 14 and at 17, and every time you cheered and you printed his face and you sent him back out. And now the war's over and you've discovered you don't like keeping a weapon in the house, and you'd like me to help you decide it was always the weapon's fault. She stood, though no one had told her she might. I won't answer the question. Find someone else to hold the knife. It was the bravest thing anyone said in that room, and it came 2 weeks too late, and Ginny knew it came too late, and that knowledge was in her face as she left the floor without being dismissed. She had found her voice in a courtroom in front of an audience, where finding it cost her only the discomfort of the Wisengamot. She had not found it in a kitchen on a wet night, where finding it would have cost her the Weasley name and might have stopped any of this. Harry watched her go and discovered that he could hold 2 true things at once without difficulty, that she had been the only person all day to refuse the knife, and that her refusal changed nothing because the room had already heard from Ron, and a refusal is not a contradiction, and the benches had a story now and would not be talked out of it by a woman declining to confirm it. Crane let her go. He had what he needed. He had not needed her to say Harry was dangerous. He had needed the room to see that even the woman who loved him would not say he was. They let Harry speak in the last hour because the law required it and because a trial in which the accused was not heard would have been a worse picture than one in which he was. You have the right to address this body before sentence, Crane said. On the matter of the night and on the matter of the petition, use it as you see fit. Harry sat in the chains and looked up at the tiers and considered, in the silence he let run a beat too long, how little he had to say. He had spent 2 years explaining himself. He had explained the war after in committee rooms and inquiries in 3 separate accounts to 3 separate bodies, each of which had thanked him and followed his testimony and built from the explanations of a tired man trying to be understood, the precise dossier they were using to bind him now. He had learned the lesson the dossier taught. Explanation was a substance the ministry collected and turned into a leash. He would not give them more of it. There were 4 people in the cellar at Cotter Mire, he said. They are alive. The court has not heard their names because the ministry moved them and asked them to be quiet, and they were quiet because they are decent people who were told it would help. I killed the man who would have killed them. I used a curse that ends things because the thing in front of me needed to end before it finished what it was saying, and there was no time to be gentle about it, and I would do it again tonight. He let that sit. That is the matter of the night. I won't say more about it because everything I have ever said in a room like this has been used to build a room like this. A mutter ran along the benches. Crane stilled it with a look. As for the petition, Harry said, Mrs. Granger has written a framework. I've read it. It's good work. It's the best argument anyone has ever made for the idea that the safest thing to do with a person who frightens you is to take from them the capacity to frighten you, and to call the taking mercy because you let them keep their pulse. He looked once at the bench where Hermione sat very straight with her chin up and her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the middle distance because she could not fix them on him. You want me to consent to be bound. You want it on the record that I chose it so that what you do to me today reads in tomorrow's prophet as something I agreed was reasonable. I won't give you that either. You understand, Crane said, that your refusal makes the more severe disposition the likelier one. I understand that you've already decided the disposition, Harry said, and that you'd prefer my signature on it. You won't get my signature. You can have everything you can take. You can't have my agreement that taking it was right. That's the one thing in this room that's still mine, and I'm keeping it. Crane regarded him for a moment over the half-moon spectacles that were not Dumbledore's, and something moved behind the mild face, some flicker of a man recognizing that the person in the chains had just declined the only role that would have made the day comfortable for everyone, and would instead make them do the thing nakedly without the courtesy of his consent. Very well, he said. The Wisengamot will deliberate. They did not deliberate long. The sentence had 3 parts and Crane read them in the order of ascending cruelty, which Harry suspected was deliberate, a man building to his strongest note. The first part stripped him. His commission in the Auror office rescinded, his Order of Merlin first class revoked, the medal to be returned to the ministry, which Harry found almost funny, the image of a clerk somewhere logging the return of a disc of metal as though it had ever weighed anything against a life. His vault at Gringotts sequestered pending review, which meant frozen, which meant the ministry had reached past the goblins into ground the goblins considered their own. And Harry noted the bench's easy assumption that this was within their power and noted that the goblins who were not represented in courtroom 10 and never had been might have a view. The second part removed him. He was to be confined, not at Azkaban, the sentence said, in a tone that asked to be thanked for the restraint, but at a secure facility maintained by the Department of Mysteries, for a term to be reviewed in 10 years and not before. The third part was Hermione's. Prior to confinement, Crane read, and as a condition of the Wisengamot's decision against the harsher penalties available to it, the magical capacity of Harry James Potter shall be bound by the procedure developed and certified by the Department of Mysteries, such binding to render him incapable of the casting of spells beyond the domestic and the trivial and to be permanent and irreversible. This is the judgment of the Wisengamot, so let it be done. The chamber did something then that Harry would remember, a long exhalation, the sound of a great many people who had been holding a fear letting it go all at once, and under the exhalation almost lost, the small sound of one person on a high bench making a noise she had not meant to make and stopping herself. He did not look at Hermione. He had decided in the cell that he would not give her his face at the moment her framework became a sentence, because the framework had been written so that she could believe it was kindness, and she would need to believe that for the rest of her life, and he was not going to make it easy by letting her see what kindness looked like from the chair. The chains slid off his wrists. Two unspeakables in their gray came down the steps to take him, and Crane gathered his papers, and the Wisengamot began the shuffle of people who have done a hard necessary thing and are eager to be elsewhere, and Harry stood, and let the gray ones take his arms and went down out of courtroom 10 toward the lower levels, where the Department of Mysteries kept the rooms it did not put on the floor plan. He went without struggle. He had not yet understood what they were about to teach him about himself. Neither had they. They did not bind him that night. The procedure required daylight above, the senior unspeakable explained, not because the sun reached the round room but because the apparatus drew on something that thinned when the sun was down, and so they put him in a holding cell in the deep levels and told him the binding would be done at dawn. The cell was older than the white room above and had none of its courtesies. Stone, a bench, a drain, a door without a seam. They had taken his shoes. They had not given him a window charm because the deep levels did not pretend, the way the courts above pretended, that the people kept here were anything other than kept. He sat on the bench with his back against the cold wall and waited for dawn and the unmaking, and he did the only thing left to a man in a seamless room, which was to go inward and look at himself and take an inventory before the inventory was taken from him. He had never done it properly before. There had never been time. His whole life had been spent pointing his magic outward at the next thing that needed surviving, and he had used it the way a man uses a hand, without examining the hand, and now that there were hours and nothing to spend them on, he turned his attention down into himself and went looking for the place the magic came from so that he might know what he was about to lose. He found it easily. Every wizard could, if they bothered, the warm root under the breastbone where the power gathered, familiar as a pulse. He held his attention on it and understood that this was the thing the apparatus would sever at dawn, the binding between him and the source, and he made himself look at it steadily so that he would remember it after he could no longer reach it. And then, because he had hours, and because going inward is like going into water and a man who keeps still keeps sinking, he sank past it. Under the warm root there was a deeper dark, and he had never been to it, and he was not sure any living wizard had, and in the deeper dark something lay very still and very large, and it was old in a way that made the round room's apparatus seem freshly painted, and it knew him. It had known him since a clearing in a forest where he had walked toward a green light without raising his wand because there was nothing left to do but die well, and had instead come back and been from that hour the master of a thing that has no master and grants its mastery only to those who have stopped being afraid of it. He had given the objects away. He had kept none of the relics but a cloak. He had thought in the tidy way the world had taught him to think that giving the objects away ended the matter. The thing in the deeper dark found that touchingly naive. It stirred just slightly at the brush of his attention the way a great dog stirs when a familiar hand finds it in sleep. And it did not wake, not yet, but it noted that the hand had finally come down to where it lay, and it settled deeper into its waiting with the patience of something that has all the time there has ever been. Harry took his attention back up out of the deep dark and sat against the cold wall and looked at the seamless door and revised in silence every assumption he had carried into the cell about what they were going to take from him at dawn. He thought about Creature waiting 2 streets from the visitor's entrance as he had been told, on the chance there was anything to collect. He had given that instruction as a man hedges a bet he expects to lose. He stopped expecting to lose it. He did not sleep. He was not any longer certain he needed to. When the gray ones came for him in what the deep levels used for mourning, they found him sitting exactly as they had left him, calm, barefoot, unhurried, looking at them with an attention that one of them would later, in a report no one would be permitted to read, describe as the attention of a man examining tools he intends to inherit. The binding room was round and very old and lined with a metal that drank the torchlight, and at its center stood the apparatus. Harry did not have a name for it and the unspeakables did not offer one. It was a ring of 9 standing stones the height of a man, each carved over every surface with runes so dense they crawled, and within the ring a single flat stone like an altar, and above the altar, suspended from nothing, a sphere of dull metal that turned slowly on an axis it had chosen for itself. The room smelled of cold water and old lightning. The runes on the stones were not a language Harry knew, and he knew several, and the not knowing told him the apparatus was older than the ministry that had inherited it, older than the language the ministry kept its records in, a thing dug up and repurposed by men who understood how to operate it and had stopped asking generations ago what it was. "It severs," said the senior unspeakable, a woman whose face he never saw clearly, "the binding between a wizard and the source he draws from. Cleanly, you will not be hurt. You will simply afterward be unable to reach the place the magic comes from. Most who undergo it describe it as forgetting a word. You knew it, and then you find you have always not known it, and the not knowing does not ache because there is nothing left to ache with." She said it kindly. She believed it was kind. Everyone that month believed they were being kind. "Lie on the stone, please. It is easier if you do not resist. Resistance only makes the severing rougher, and the roughness is the only pain in it." Harry lay on the stone. He looked up at the turning sphere and the 9 crawling stones and the drinking dark above them, and he found that he was not afraid, and he examined the absence of fear the careful way he examined everything that year, because the absence was data. A man being unmade should be afraid. He searched himself for the fear and found instead the banked coal that had been sitting in his chest since the White Room, and over it the cold clarity, and under both of them, deeper than he had ever reached before, in a place he had not known had a floor, something turned over in its sleep. The unspeakables took their positions at the 9 stones. The senior woman raised her wand to the sphere. She spoke a word in the dense old language, and the runes on the 9 stones woke, and the room filled with the cold water smell and a pressure that was not sound, and the apparatus reached down into Harry Potter to find the binding between him and the source he drew from so that it might cut it. It found the binding, it cut it. And then it kept reaching because the cut had not done what cutting was supposed to do, because under the place where a wizard's magic was rooted, where the severing should have ended in clean dark, the apparatus encountered something it had no carving for, a deeper rooting, an allegiance Harry had carried since a clearing in the Forbidden Forest where 3 objects had answered to one hand, and the apparatus, which knew how to sever a man from his magic, did not know what to do with a man who was the master of the thing that severs all things from all things. The Hallows had never left him. He had given the stone back to the forest floor and walked away. He had returned the Elder Wand to tomb and meant it. He had kept only the cloak and told himself that ended it, and the wizarding world, which loved a tidy story, had agreed that it ended it. But mastery of death is not a wand you can set down. It is not a stone in the leaf litter. It had recognized him in a clearing when he walked to his own death without flinching and came back, and recognition, once given, is not a thing that can be returned to a tomb. He had simply stopped thinking about it in the 2 tired years, the way a man stops thinking about a debt that no one has come to collect. Something came to collect now. The sphere above the altar stopped turning. The 9 stones, which had been waking, went past waking into state the apparatus had never been built to reach, the runes flaring white and then past white into a color the eye reported and the mind refused, and the cold water smell became the smell of the air before lightning and then the smell after, scorched and clean. The senior unspeakable's word died in her throat. The pressure that was not sound rose until the standing stones themselves began very slowly to lean inward, drawn toward the figure on the altar as iron toward a lodestone, and the dark above the apparatus, the drinking dark, thinned, and through the thinning place Harry saw, for the length of a breath he would never afterward be able to describe to anyone, the shape of the thing that had answered. It did not have a face, it had attention. It regarded the apparatus that presumed to sever bindings, and it regarded the men and women who had built their small, careful authority on the ability to take a wizard's magic away, and it found their presumption not offensive, because offense requires a peer, but simply incorrect, a category error, a child's drawing of a door held up against a real wall. And it regarded Harry lying on the stone where they had laid him to be unmade, and in the place under the place where his magic had been rooted, where the apparatus had reached and recoiled, it settled its attention like a hand settling on the shoulder of an heir who has finally come of age. Master, it did not say because it did not use words, but the meaning of the word arrived in Harry intact, and with it arrived everything that had been waiting under the floor he had not known had a floor. The apparatus failed. It did not explode, which would have been a thing the ministry could write a report about. It simply stopped being an apparatus. The 9 standing stones, leaning inward, met the limit of what they could become and exceeded it, and the dense old runes that men had operated for generations without understanding completed all at once a sentence those men had never finished reading, and the sentence's meaning was release. Whatever the apparatus had been built to contain, it had been containing for a very long time, and it let go, and the round room filled with gray ones falling to their knees in a light that did not illuminate. And at the center of it Harry Potter sat up on the altar where they had laid him to take everything, and found that they had instead, with great ceremony, handed him the only thing that had ever truly been his. He stood. The chains were gone. The binding cords were ash. His magic had been severed, and the severing had reached the older root, and the older root had answered, and what stood up off the altar was not the wizard the Wisengamot had sentenced. It was something with a wizard's shape and a wizard's memories, and underneath, a foundation the ministry's law had no word for and no carving for and no authority over. The senior unspeakable knelt in the gray light with her wand fallen from her hand, and she looked up at him, and her face, which he had never seen clearly, he saw clearly now. There was no kindness left in it. There was the look of a woman who had spent her life cataloging the deep rooms of magic and had been certain until the present moment that she understood the inventory. "What are you?" she said. Harry stepped down off the altar. The gray floor was cold under his bare feet, and he registered the cold, and it meant nothing. "You spent the afternoon," he said, "deciding what I was, a weapon, a danger, a hole in the structure, a problem to be solved with a procedure." He looked at the failed apparatus, the leaning stones, the dark that had thinned and was slowly, reluctantly, becoming only dark again. "You were closer than you knew. You just had the direction wrong. You thought you were taking something away." He walked toward the door the gray ones had brought him through, and they did not rise to stop him because they could not, because some part of each of them had seen the thing in the thinning dark and understood that stopping him was not among the options the world still contained. "You were giving it back." He did not run because there was nothing left in the building fast enough to be worth running from. He walked up through the Department of Mysteries past doors that opened for him without being asked, through the atrium where the night shift looked up from their desks and did not understand what they were seeing and so did nothing, and out, finally, into the London dark above, real night over a real city, the rain finished and the pavement shining. Creature was waiting at the mouth of an alley 2 streets from the visitor's entrance, because Harry had told him in the kitchen on the night of the arrest where to wait and when on the chance that there would be anything left to collect. "Master," Creature said, and stopped and looked at him with the elf's ancient eyes gone wide, because Creature had served the Black family through 3 generations of dark and could feel what walked toward him in a way the night shift could not. He bowed lower than he had ever bowed. "Master has changed. Master is leaving," Harry said. "Take me somewhere the ministry has never heard of, somewhere old, you know the places, your family kept the kind of secrets that don't go in floor plans." Creature's eyes filled and the tears were not grief. "Creature knows a place," he said. "Creature has always known the place. The mistress's people came from it and before them others, and it has been waiting." He held out a knobbed hand. "It has been waiting a very long time, Master, for someone who could open the door." Harry took the hand. By morning the ministry had a problem and no language for it. The binding facility was a ruin of leaning stone and gray-robed unspeakables who would not or could not say what they had witnessed, and the prisoner was gone, and the apparatus that had operated for 200 years was a sentence finished and could not be made to do anything ever again. By noon a decision had been taken at the highest levels that the prisoner Harry Potter had perished in the course of the binding procedure, the dangerous instability of his own magic having proved, tragically, incompatible with the severing, exactly as certain experts had warned. The prophet ran it under a photograph that was not 3 years old this time but newer, taken at the trial, the accused in the chains looking up at the benches with an expression the caption called defiance, and that was, if anyone had looked closely, something much quieter and much worse for everyone above him on the tiers. The country read that its dangerous man was dead by his own dark power and grieved a little, in the careful way you grieve a thing you are relieved to be rid of, and went back to being afraid of smaller things. Kingsley Shacklebolt held his coalition. Hermione Granger's framework was entered into the permanent record as the certified procedure for the containment of dangerous magical persons, a lasting contribution to the safety of the realm, and she accepted the commendation and went home and did not sleep and told herself the part of the story she would need to keep telling herself, which was that she had tried to save him and the danger in him had killed him in the end exactly as she had feared, and that her framework had been mercy. And that none of it had been her hand. Far to the north, in a place that did not appear on any map the ministry kept, where the sea worked at black cliffs in a house older than the statute of secrecy stood behind wards that recognized an heir who had been a very long time coming, Harry Potter stood at a window above the water and was not dead and was not bound and was not any longer anybody's weapon. The coal in his chest had stopped being a coal. It had become a foundation, cold and level and load-bearing, the kind a man builds on. He watched the gray sea throw itself at the cliffs and fall back and gather and throw itself again, patient, certain, in no hurry at all, and he understood that he had time now, more of it than the people on the tiers could imagine, and that the thing about a man they have declared dead is that he no longer has to account to anyone for what he does with the years they think he isn't having. He would learn this house. He would learn what his inheritance could do, and then when he was ready and not 1 hour before, he would go back down to the world that had counted the votes, and he would teach it the difference between a weapon it had decided to discard and a sovereign it had been too small to recognize. He was done forgiving. He found that the discovery did not trouble him at all. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, the forge the house had no name that anyone living remembered, and it stood where the land gave out. Creature took him there along the elf roads, which were not roads, which were the spaces between apparition and the place it deposits you, and which the ministry had never mapped because the ministry had never thought to ask the beings who used them. They came out of the dark onto black cliffs in the small hours, the sea below working at the rock with the indifference of a thing that has been doing one job since before there were eyes to watch it do it, and above the cliffs set back from the edge a house. It was not large. That surprised him later when he had learned what it contained. From the cliff path it looked like a tall stone farmhouse that had been added to across centuries by people who did not consult one another, a gable here, a wing there, a tower that served no purpose the outside could explain. The windows were dark. The door was oak gone gray with salt. And over all of it lay a stillness Harry recognized from Cawdor Mire and from Courtroom 10, the stillness of a warded place, except that this was not the flat, listening pressure of the Ministry's wards. This was deeper and older, and it did not listen. It waited. The blacks held it, Creature said, very quiet, on the cliff path in the mistress's grandmother's time and her grandmother's grandmother's. They held it and did not live in it because it would not have them. They were too new. Creature heard the old elves speak of it, the ones who served before Creature was whelped. They said the house belonged to the line behind the line, the people the blacks married into to pretend they were older than they were. His ancient eyes turned up to Harry. They said it would open only for the heir of the three brothers. Creature did not know what that meant. Creature knows now. Harry walked up to the gray door. He did not touch it. He stood in front of it and let it consider him because he understood from his night in the seamless cell that things this old did not respond to being handled, they responded to being recognized, and he reached down into himself past the warm root into the deeper dark where the thing that knew him lay waiting, and he let the house see what was down there. The door opened. It did not creak. It swung inward on a dark that smelled of cold stone and old parchment, and faintly under those of the air after lightning, the smell he had last breathed in a round room while an apparatus failed, and the house knew that smell and welcomed it home. He crossed the threshold of the place that had been waiting for him since before his family had a name, and behind him Creature made a sound that was not quite a sob, the sound of a servant who has carried a secret so long he had stopped believing he would live to set it down, and the gray door closed, and Harry Potter began the work of becoming the thing they had been so afraid he might be. The house taught him in the manner of old things, which is to say it taught him nothing and made everything available. There was a library, and the library was the reason for the tower that served no purpose the outside could explain, because inside it served every purpose. Rising through floors the exterior did not have room for shelf above shelf into a dark the eye lost before the shelves did. The books were not the books the Ministry licensed. They were not the books Hogwarts kept behind a rope in a restricted section and pretended were dangerous. They were the books the licensed books had been written to replace, the older grammar, the magic from before the statute taught wizards to be small and secret and ashamed, and they did not explain themselves to a casual reader, and Harry was not any longer a casual anything. He read. He had always been able to work when work was the only thing standing between him and a worse outcome, and now there was no worse outcome and no better one, only the work and the years he had been given by a world that thought him dead, and he poured himself into the reading with a focus that frightened Creature, who took to leaving food on the long table and removing it untouched and leaving more. He learned the old grammar first because everything else stood on it. Modern spellwork was a vocabulary, a set of fixed words that did fixed things, and a modern wizard was fluent in the vocabulary and ignorant of the language under it, the way a man can recite a prayer in a tongue he does not speak. The old grammar was the language. It taught not spells, but the principles. Spells were special cases of intention and cost and binding and release, the actual machinery of how a will reshapes the world and what the world charges for the reshaping. A wizard who knew only the vocabulary could cast 1,000 spells and never invent one. A wizard who knew the grammar could look at a thing that needed doing and build the spell to do it on the spot, from first principles, the way a man who understands fire does not need to be handed a match. He stopped using his voice for magic in the second month, because the grammar made plain that the words were training wheels, a scaffold to hold a wizard's intention steady until his intention could stand on its own, and Harry's intention had been forged in a kitchen and a courtroom and a round room and did not wobble. He stopped using a wand in the fourth month for the same reason, keeping the holly wand he had recovered only for the work that genuinely wanted a focus, learning to let the magic come up out of the deep root and through his hands and into the world without a stick to apologize to. He built himself opponents to practice against because the cliffs offered nothing that could push him, and a wizard who only ever trains against air learns to fight air. The grammar allowed it. From the old principles he assembled constructs, figures of bound force and borrowed shape that could move and strike and adapt, and he set them on himself in the long hall of the house, 3 at a time and then 5 and then as many as the hall would hold, and he taught his hands the answer to every line of attack a wizard could open, until the answers stopped being thought and became reflex, and then he changed the constructs so that the old reflexes failed and built new ones and did it again. He had been a fine duelist before, fast and lucky and willing. He had relied, he saw now, on speed and luck and willingness, the resources of a young man with no time to learn better. The house gave him time. He spent it dismantling the duelist he had been and assembling in its place something that did not rely on luck because it had closed every avenue by which luck was needed. A modern duel was an exchange of vocabulary, spell against counterspell, each wizard reaching into a memory. Harry stopped fighting from the list. He fought from the grammar, building each effect to the precise shape the moment required, so that an opponent expecting a known curse met instead a thing assembled in the half-second between intention and result, a thing with no counter because no counter had ever been written for it. He learned to cast without word or wand against 5 moving constructs and lose nothing in power for the silence, the magic coming up clean out of the deep root and going where his attention sent it. He learned to hold a ward and break a ward in the same motion. He learned to take a hall full of force directed at his life and let most of it pass through the space he had ceased an instant before to occupy. The holly wand became in his hands not a crutch but an instrument he chose, a focus for the work that wanted fineness rather than force, and he found he could do more with it now than he had ever managed when it had been the only thing standing between him and death, because he no longer needed it and so could use it freely, the difference between a man who clutches a tool and a man who has mastered one. He repaired its old hurts with the grammar. He woke things in its phoenix core that Ollivander had bound dormant for safety, and the wand, which had chosen a frightened boy on a rainy afternoon, seemed to recognize that he had finally grown into the choice. By the end of the second year, there was nothing in the house that could press him because he had become the thing the house had been built to contain, and the constructs he raised fell in seconds, and he raised harder ones, and they fell too. He did not mistake this for being unbeatable. He had read enough history in the Long Tower to know that the wizard who believes himself unbeatable is merely the wizard who has not yet met the thing that beats him. But he had become, with cold certainty, the most dangerous wizard the country had produced since the one he had killed at 17, and unlike that one he had a foundation under the danger, level, and load-bearing, and a warm room at the center he had resolved to keep lit, and a single clear idea of the demolition ahead. And under the grammar, under the reading, under the slow, terrible discipline of teaching himself to be the most dangerous thing in any room he might ever again enter, there was the inheritance. He approached it carefully. He had learned caution from the apparatus, which had reached for a root it did not understand and unmade itself. The thing in the deep dark was not a power he wielded. It was a relationship he had with the oldest fact in the world, and the relationship had terms, and he set himself to learning the terms before he tested them. He learned that he could not be bound, because binding is a kind of ending and endings answered to him now and not the other way around. He learned that the dead were not to him entirely gone, that there was a thinness near him through which their attention could press, and that he could press back, and that this was a door he resolved to open rarely and close quickly, because he had watched a man named Tom build a kingdom out of refusing to let go of the dead, and he had no intention of building the same kingdom by the opposite road. He learned that wounds closed on him faster than they should, that tiredness did not collect in him as it once had, that the years he had been given might be more years than a wizard was meant to have, and he sat with that knowledge on a night when the sea was loud and decided that he would not let it make him patient in the way it had made Tom patient, hoarding centuries against the living. He would use the time, he would not become the time. Death, if that was the right name for the attention in the deep dark, never spoke. It was not a companion and not a servant and not, he came to understand, a person at all, any more than gravity is a person. It was a fact that had taken an interest. Now and then in the work, when he reached too far or asked the grammar for something the grammar could give only at a price, he felt the attention turned toward him, neither warning nor encouraging, simply present, the regard of the one power in the universe that had never once been impressed by anybody, and he found that he did not want to disappoint it, and understood that this too was a kind of leash, and was almost grateful for it. Because a man remaking himself into a weapon needs at least one thing in the world he is unwilling to be small in front of. He did not keep count of the months. The house did not have clocks, and the sea did not care, and creature, when asked, would only say that master had been at the work a long time and should eat. But the seasons turned in the high windows of the tower, gray to green to gold to gray, and turned again and turned a third time, and somewhere in the third turning the thing Harry had set out to forge was forged, and the only sign of it was that the house, which had waited so long for an heir who could open the door, began very faintly to feel crowded. He found his own name in the library in the second winter, which was not a thing he had gone looking for, and was not, he came to suspect, a coincidence. The book was on a low shelf he had passed 100 times, bound in a leather gone soft as cloth, and it opened in his hands to a page that had been waiting, the way the door had waited, the way the house had waited. It was a genealogy drawn in a hand older than printing, and it began with 3 brothers, and Harry had been told the 3 brothers were a story for children, a tale to teach the lesson that the wise man does not run from death but greets it as an old friend, and he had believed the lesson and discarded the brothers, the way you discard the wrapping once you have the gift. The genealogy did not treat them as a story. It treated them as ancestors. Antioch, who took a wand that could not be beaten and was murdered for it in his sleep, his line ended in a night. Cadmus, who took a stone that called back the dead and was destroyed by the calling, his line guttering down through madness and grief. And Ignatus, the youngest, who asked death for a way to leave its sight and was given a cloak, and used it not to hide from the world but to walk through it unnoticed until he was old and tired and ready, and who then, the genealogy said in a phrase that had been copied and recopied across centuries by hands that did not understand it, greeted death as an equal, and they departed together, and the cloak passed to his son. The line of Ignatus ran down the page through names Harry did not know, and then through names he did, thinning, marrying out, the great inheritance forgotten by descendants who kept only a useful family heirloom and a habit of being lucky in dark places, until near the bottom of the long page, in ink that looked no older than the rest, though the rest was centuries dead, the line reached a name he had worn his whole life without knowing it was the end of anything. Potter, James. And under it, last on the page, a single word in the old hand written. It seemed in anticipation long before the man who would wear the name had drawn breath. He sat with the book a long time. The cloak he had carried since he was 11, the one that had let a boy walk unseen through a castle full of danger, was not a clever artifact a headmaster had loaned him. It was the actual mantle of Ignatus Peveril, handed down 1,000 years to the only descendant who would ever need the whole of what it meant, and the inheritance it implied was not a power he had acquired. It was a thing he had been born owed, that had been moving toward him his entire life, that had recognized him in a clearing not because he was brave, but because he was the one the long page had been waiting for. The ministry had sentenced the boy who lived. They had had no idea they were laying hands on the heir of the brother who walked away from death as an equal, because they had decided 3 centuries before that such things were stories and had taught the stories to children and forgotten there had ever been anything under them. He closed the book. He understood then that the foundation he was building was not as new as he had thought. He was not inventing a power, he was coming into one. He tested the limit once, deliberately, on the longest night of the second winter, because a man who means to wield a thing must first learn what the thing will and will not let him do. He prepared for a week. The grammar was clear that what he intended had a cost, and clearer still that the cost was the kind a careless man pays without noticing until it has bankrupted him. And so he did it carefully in the oldest room of the house, a round chamber at the foot of the tower that the blacks had never been permitted to enter, where the stone was older than language and the floor bore a design that the house had cut into it before there were Peverils to inherit anything. He set no candles. He brought no wand. He went down into himself past the warm root into the deep dark where the attention lay, and he asked it in the grammar of intention that needs no words to let him look through the thin place at the world on its other side. The attention regarded him. It did not refuse. Refusal was not among the things it did. It simply showed him the cost first, holding it up so that he could not say afterward that he had not been told, and the cost was this: that every time he opened the thin place, it would be a little harder to believe the living mattered more than the dead, because the dead would be right there and they would want things, and the wanting of the dead is patient and total and does not stop, and a man who can hear it learns slowly to arrange his life around it, and that is how the long page of his cousins had guttered into madness and grief. He looked at the cost. He accepted it for one night and no more, and the thin place opened. It did not open like a door, it opened like an eye that had always been there deciding to see. The round chamber filled with no light and a great deal of attention, and the air took on the scorch-clean smell of the moment after lightning, and Harry stood in the center of the ancient design and looked through. And on the other side there was not fire and not punishment and not reward, only an immensity level and gray and without horizon, across which the dead moved or did not move, and some of them turned toward the thin place where a living man stood looking, and he felt their attention reach for him. And it was not malice and it was not love, it was simply hunger, the hunger of those who have crossed over for the one who has not, the appalling magnetism of the unfinished toward the finishing. He saw shapes he half knew and did not let himself name, because naming would have been a kind of calling, and calling was Cadmus's road, and he had read where Cadmus's road went. He held the thin place open exactly as long as it took to learn the one thing he had come to learn, which was whether the power was real and whether it answered to him, and the answer to both was yes, written across the gray immensity in a script that needed no reading, and the moment he had the answer he closed the eye. It resisted. That was the lesson inside the lesson, the thing the grammar had warned of and the cost had named. The thin place, once open, did not want to shut, and the dead, once aware of him, did not want to lose the warm, bright, unfinished thing they had felt at the threshold. And for a long, terrible moment Harry stood in the round chamber and felt the pull of the gray immensity, the seductive arithmetic by which a man decides the dead are more worth his attention than the living, the precise pull that had built a monster out of Tom Riddle, who had so feared the gray that he had torn his own soul into pieces rather than cross into it. Harry felt the pull and understood Tom for the first time not as a villain but as a man who had stood where Harry stood and been unable to look away, and the understanding was the most dangerous moment of the 3 years, because to understand a thing is to be halfway to forgiving yourself for becoming it. He thought of a table in Devon. He thought of a fist closing around 2 of his fingers. He thought of the warm room Luna had not yet told him about, but that he was already, without the word for it, refusing to let go out. And he shut the thin place by force with the whole of the will that had been forged in a kitchen in a courtroom, and the eye closed, and the round chamber was only a cold room in an old house on a winter night, and Harry knelt on the ancient design with his hands flat on stone that had been cut before his line began, and breathed, and did not open it again. He had his answer. The inheritance was real, and it was his, and it would let him do very nearly anything, and the price of the largest things it offered was the one price he had decided, kneeling on that floor, he would never pay, the price of caring more for the dead who could not be wronged than for the living who could. The men on the tiers had feared he would become Voldemort. They had been right to fear it. They had simply been wrong about the reason, which was not that he was dark, but that he had been handed, by an accident of blood and an act of cruelty, the exact same door the Dark Lord had walked through, and the only thing standing between Harry and that door was a moor in Devon and a woman who would tell him no and a child who waved. He rose off the floor of the round chamber a different instrument than the one that had knelt. He had not gained a spell. He had gained the knowledge of his own ceiling, which was higher than any living wizard's, and the knowledge of his own floor, which was a promise, and a wizard who knows both is no longer a weapon anyone else can aim. He went back up the tower to the library and the grammar and the long patient work, and he did not test the limit again because he no longer needed to, because the test was not about the dead. It had been about whether he could choose the living with the door standing open. He could. That was the whole of the forge, everything else was only craft. Luna Lovegood arrived on a morning in the third spring walking up the cliff path as though she had an appointment, which in a sense Harry did not yet understand she did. No one walked up the cliff path, the path did not connect to anywhere a person could walk from. The wards that had kept the blacks out for centuries should have turned her gently around 3 miles back and left her convinced she had meant to go the other way. Creature found her at the grey door, having tea from a flask, waiting with the patience of someone who has arrived early and does not mind, and he came to the tower in a state and reported that there was a Lovegood on the step and the wards had let her sit down. Harry came down. He had not spoken to a human being who was not Creature in something close to 3 years, and he discovered, descending the tower stair, that he did not know what his voice would do and that he was curious about it, and that the curiosity was itself a piece of news, the first thing in a long time he had felt that was not the work. She looked up from her flask. She had changed and she had not. She was older and there was a thinness to her that had not been there before, the thinness of someone who had also been used hard by the years since the war, and her eyes were the same, pale and direct and entirely unbothered by the fact that they were looking at a dead man. "Hello, Harry," Luna said. "You're not very dead." "No," he agreed. "I didn't think you were. Everyone else did. They had a service. It was lovely and completely wrong, the way services usually are." She offered him the flask. "I knew you weren't dead because the Raxperts went quiet when they announced it, and they only do that when someone's lying on a very large scale, so I started looking. It took me ages. You're behind some truly excellent wards." She said this as a compliment, one professional to another, the same register the child had waved to him in. "Aren't you going to ask how I found you? You're going to tell me regardless." "I followed the place where the world is thin," Luna said simply, and the simplicity stopped him because it was exactly right, because she had no grammar and no library and no inheritance and had nonetheless looked at the map of the world and seen the thin place he had become and walked toward it on a path that did not exist. "It's very thin around you now, thinner than it should be around a living person. I wanted to make sure it was you in here and not something wearing you. It's you." She tilted her head, mostly. She stayed. He did not ask her to and she did not ask to, and neither of those absences was an accident. She told him about the world in the days that followed, sitting in the tower or walking the cliff path that should not have admitted her. And she told it as she told everything sideways, the important facts arriving wrapped in nonsense so that a careless listener would have dismissed the lot, and Harry was not a careless listener and had not been for years. She told him Kingsley still held the ministry, but held it the way a man holds a door in a wind, that the dangerous magical person's machinery he had been bound under had not been dismantled after his death but expanded, that it caught smaller and smaller people now, that the country had developed an appetite for the safety of removing the frightening, and the frightening had been redefined downward to keep the machinery fed. She told him the goblins in the ministry were quarreling again over the old questions of who owned what was kept in a vault, and that the quarrel had teeth this time. She told him Ron Weasley had a department now and a portrait commissioned and a way of telling the story of the friend he had lost that made people buy him drinks. She told him Hermione had risen and did not look well. She told him about Teddy. That was the thing she had come carrying under all the rest, and she set it down last as she had set down the news of his own false death first, because she understood the order things needed to arrive in. "Andromeda's tired, Harry," Luna said. "She won't say it. She's raising him alone and she's not young, and the ministry's been at her, soft little visits, asking whether a woman her age and her family history is really the best place for the orphan of 2 war heroes, and they mean well the way a knife means well, and one day they won't be asking." She looked at him steadily. "He's 7, he asks about you. Andromeda tells him you loved him and you're gone, because what else is she going to tell him?" And he started to stop asking, which is worse. Children stop asking when they've decided the answer is no. Harry sat with that. Outside the tower the sea did its old work on the rock. He had built in 3 years a foundation cold and level and load-bearing, and he had told himself the foundation was for the world that broke him, and it was. But it was not only for that, and Luna had just reminded him of the other thing it was for, the promise made in a kitchen in Devon with a child's fist around 2 of his fingers, the one line he had resolved not to cross no matter what he became on the far side of it. "Bring me to him," Harry said. "Not as I was. I won't lie to a 7-year-old and tell him nothing's changed, but bring me, and then I want you to tell me everything you've ever noticed about how the ministry watches the people it's decided to take, because Andromeda is not going to be one of them." Luna considered him with her pale, direct eyes. "You've gone very cold," she observed, without judgment, an entomologist noting a wing. "Colder than cod or mire. There's a great deal of you that's just gone to ice." "Yes, but not all of it." She nodded, satisfied, having confirmed her hypothesis. "Good, the ones who go all the way to ice become like the one we fought. You've left a warm room in the middle. That's the only difference between you and him, you know, just the one warm room. You should be careful never to let it go out, because the day it goes out you won't notice and there'll be no one left who's allowed to tell you." She stood, brushing crumbs from her robes. "I'll take you to Teddy on Thursday. He'll be at school until 3. We can surprise Andromeda for tea. She likes lemon things. You never remember that. I'll bring lemon things. The reunion was on the moor in Devon, and it broke something open in him that the years on the cliffs had frozen shut, and he let it deliberately because Luna was right about the warm room, and he had no intention of letting it go out. Teddy was 7 and tall for it, and his hair was its own honest mouse brown, because he had stopped performing the colors for an audience that had grown too sad to delight. And when Harry came through Andromeda's wards onto the moor, Teddy looked at him for a long moment with the wariness of a child who has been disappointed by hope before, and then something in his small face decided, and the hair went all at once, a violent and delighted green. And Harry caught him out of the air the way you catch a thing you have been falling toward for 3 years. Andromeda stood in the doorway with a cloth in her hands, older, thinner, exactly as Luna had said, and she looked at Harry over Teddy's green head, and she did not ask where he had been or what he had become, because she could see what he had become. It was written in how the moor's light seemed to bend a degree toward him. And she had told him on a different doorstep that this world breaks the people who carry it, and that the only ones it doesn't break are the ones who stop letting it decide what they are. You came back, she said. I told him I would. You told me you wouldn't be back as this. She looked at him a moment longer, taking the measure of the this. You weren't wrong, but you kept the promise to him, and that's the only one that signified. She stepped back from the door. Come in, there's tea. Luna's brought lemon things, which means you finally told her you can't remember I like them, which is the most sensible thing you've done in years. Wipe your feet. Whatever you are now, you're not too grand to wipe your feet in my house. He wiped his feet. He sat at the table in Devon where nobody wanted anything from him, with a 7-year-old narrating the entire history of the intervening 3 years between mouthfuls of lemon cake, and he let the warm room in the middle of all the ice stay lit, and he understood that Andromeda's table was not a weakness in the foundation he had built. It was the thing the foundation was load-bearing for. A throne with nothing warm under it was just a chair a frightened man had climbed onto, and he had met the frightened man on that throne in a graveyard at 14 and had no intention of becoming him. When Teddy had been put to bed, the three of them sat in the lamplight, and Andromeda poured something stronger than tea, and Harry told them plainly what he intended. They didn't make a mistake when they broke me, he said. That's the thing I needed 3 years to understand. Mistake is a thing you correct. They didn't err. The machine worked exactly as it was built to work. It used me until I frightened it, and then it removed me, and it would do the same to anyone who got as useful and as dangerous as I did, and it's doing a smaller version of it right now to people with no cliffs to disappear to. The machine isn't broken. The machine is the problem, and you don't fix a machine by feeding it a better person. You take it apart. He turned the glass and did not drink. I'm going to take it apart, not burn it. Burning it makes a martyr of it and a tyrant of me, and I've read enough about the last man who burned it to know how that ends. I'm going to expose it piece by piece until the country that cheered when they bound me looks at what it did and cannot look away, and then I'm going to build something in its place that can't do to the next person what it did to me. And I'm going to rule the thing I build because I've watched what happens when good people hand power to a structure and trust the structure to be decent, and I'm done trusting structures. Andromeda watched him over her glass. That's how every tyrant in history has started, she said. Every single one, a wrong that wanted righting and a man certain he was the one to right it. I know, do you? That's why she's here. Harry nodded at Luna, who was examining the lamp for signs of an infestation only she could see. And why I'll be at this table every week the campaign allows, and more weeks than it allows. The tyrants you're describing all had one thing in common. By the time they had the power, there was no one left who was allowed to tell them no. I'm building the no into the structure from the start. Luna, who can see when I've gone too cold, you who buried better-lived people than me and won't be impressed by anything. And him, asleep upstairs, who I made a promise to before I made any of this, and who I'll lose the day I become the thing he'd be ashamed of. He set the glass down untouched. Tell me no when I need it, both of you. That's the price of my visits, and I'm paying it gladly, and it's the smartest thing I've built. Luna stopped examining the lamp. I'll tell you no, she said. I'm very good at no. People think I agree with everything because I'm pleasant about disagreeing. She smiled at him, pale and certain. When are you going back down? Soon, Harry said. There's a quarrel between the goblins and the ministry. Quarrels are doors. I'm going to walk through that one first, because the goblins remember a thing the wizarding world has spent 3 centuries forgetting, which is what I am, and they'll deal with the heir of the 3 brothers in a language the Wisengamot doesn't speak. He stood, and the lamplight bent its degree toward him, and Andromeda watched it bend and said nothing. I came back to tell you I'm alive, and to keep a promise, and to hand the 2 of you the only check on me that's going to exist. Everything after this is going to look, from the outside, like a dead man taking the country apart. From the inside, it's going to be exactly that. I want at least 3 people in the world who know the difference. He crossed back onto British soil on a grey afternoon at the end of the 3rd year, alone on foot. Over a stretch of coast the ministry did not watch because there had never in its memory been anything there worth watching. He wore plain dark robes and carried nothing the eye would catch, and he looked to the gulls and the one fisherman who glanced up and then back down at his nets like a man walking a beach in poor weather. He was not. He was the thing the Wisengamot had been right to fear and wrong about in every particular, returning to the country that had buried him with a quiet and a patience that the buried owe to no one. He stopped where the sand gave way to the first scrub of land, and he looked inland, toward London, toward the ministry and the courts and the round room and the people who had counted the votes, and he took the measure of the work ahead the way a builder takes the measure of a structure he intends to demolish and replace without anger, without hurry, with the cold attention of a man who has all the time there has ever been and a single, perfectly clear idea of what he means to do with it. The first piece was the goblins. After the goblins, the prophet. After the prophet, the men who had testified, each in the order their exposure would do the most structural damage. And under all of it, holding it up, the long, slow demolition of the idea that the wizarding world had any right to make a weapon of a child and discard the weapon when the child grew a will. He would not announce himself. Announcement was what Tom had done, what frightened men did, men who needed the world to watch them be powerful because they did not, underneath, believe they were. Harry did not need to be watched. He needed only to be correct and to be patient and to be, when the moment came, entirely impossible to stop. He walked inland into the gray, and the country that thought him 3 years dead went about its afternoon, and did not feel the hand close. Yet, around the loose thread it had left hanging when it decided the simplest thing to do with the man who saved it was to break him and bury the pieces. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. First moves. He went to the goblins first, because the goblins were the only power in Britain that had never once been impressed by the Ministry of Magic, and a man who means to take a structure apart begins with the people who already resent it. Gringotts did not open its doors to Harry Potter, who was dead, and he had not expected it to. He sent instead a single line, written in the old grammar on a leaf of vellum that could not be copied or forged or read by any hand but the one it was addressed to, and he sent it not to a teller or a manager but to the deep council of the Goblin Nation, by root creatures people knew and the bank's wards did not watch, because the bank's wards had been built to keep wizards out and had never imagined a wizard who could ask the elf roads for a favor. The line said, "The heir of the three brothers requests an audience and will discuss the matter of the vaults the ministry has presumed to seize." They answered within the day. That told him most of what he needed to know about how angry they were. They received him below the bank, far below, past the dragon and the thundering carts, in the levels the public was permitted to imagine, in a chamber cut from the living rock that no wizard had entered in living memory. The goblins had built it for their own councils, and the proportions were theirs, low and broad and weighted toward the floor, and the torches burned with a metal light that did not flatter, and around a long table of black stone sat the high council of the Goblin Nation, and they did not stand when he entered, which he respected, because standing would have been a courtesy and they owed him none, and they were too honest to pretend otherwise. At the head of the table sat Ragnarok, who was old even by the measure of goblins, whose hands were folded on the black stone and whose eyes had the flat, patient brightness of a creature that had watched empires negotiate in default. He looked at Harry for a long moment, and Harry let him look, standing easy at the foot of the table with his hands open at his sides, offering the council the rare spectacle of a wizard who had come to ask for something and did not seem to need it. "You are dead," Ragnarok said. "The goblin language has a word for the kind of dead a wizard becomes when his ministry finds him inconvenient, and it is not the word for the kind of dead a body becomes," and Ragnarok used the first. "The ministry is dead," Harry said. "I'm only inconvenient. They've confused the two before." A sound moved along the black table that might, in a creature less dignified, have been a laugh. Ragnarok did not smile, because goblins do not waste expressions on wizards, but something behind the flat, bright eyes adjusted, the recalibration of a negotiator who has just learned that the person across the table is going to be more interesting than the morning's agenda had promised. "You sign yourself the heir of the three brothers," Ragnarok said. "That is an old claim. It is older than your ministry, older than your statute, older than the treaty by which your kind and mine agreed to lie to each other about who owns what. We have not heard it made in 900 years. The last who made it we did not believe, and we were right not to. Why should the council believe a dead wizard who walks the underroads and writes in a grammar your schools forgot?" Harry did not argue. Argument was a wizard's instrument, the marrying of true facts to false implications, and it would have insulted the table. He did the other thing instead. He reached down into himself, past the warm root, into the deep dark where the attention lay, and he let it rise just enough, just to the surface of him, the air of the chamber taking on the scorched clean smell of the moment after lightning, the metal torchlight guttering and leaning toward him as the standing stones had leaned in a round room, and every goblin at the black table went very still. Because goblins are creatures of the deep places, and they know the smell of old death the way a sailor knows the smell of a coming storm, and they had felt nothing like it in their tunnels since before the treaty was signed. He held it for the length of 3 breaths and let it sink again, and the torches steadied and the smell faded, and Ragnarok unfolded his hands on the black stone. "Ah," the old goblin said very softly. "So, not a claim, a fact." He regarded Harry with an attention that had entirely lost its flatness. "The brothers' line, the cloak that left death's sight, the stone that called the dead, the wand that could not be beaten. We kept the records your kind burned. We knew the line had thinned to a family of lucky fools who had forgotten what they were. We did not know it had come at last to a point." He leaned forward. "What does the heir of the three brothers want with the Goblin Nation that he comes to us before he comes to anyone?" "I want what you want," Harry said. "Your charters say the contents of a vault belong to the one who holds it, and that the bank is sovereign over its own ground, and that no wizarding authority may reach past your doors." The ministry sequestered my vault while I stood in their court, and they did it as though your charters were a courtesy they extend and may withdraw, and the council let it pass, because the vault belonged to a man they were about to declare dead, and there seemed no profit in a quarrel over a dead man's gold. He let that land. They've done it 11 more times since, I've counted. 11 vaults seized under the dangerous person's provision, 11 times your sovereignty treated as a polite fiction, and each time it's been easier than the last because each time the council weighed a single wizard's gold against a war with the ministry and chose, sensibly, the gold. That's how a sovereignty dies, not in a battle, in a series of sensible decisions not to fight one. The black table was silent. He had named a thing the council had been telling itself was prudence and shown them it was decay, and goblins do not forgive a wizard who tells them an unwelcome truth, but they do not forget him either, and forgetting was the enemy here, not forgiveness. You propose, Ragnarok said slowly, that we fight the next one. I propose, Harry said, that the next vault the ministry reaches for be one the goblin nation defends absolutely, in full, with every charter and every right and every old terror you have not had cause to show the wizarding world in 3 centuries. I propose that you make an example so total that no minister for the next 100 years dares write the words sequester and Gringotts in the same document. And I propose that the vault you choose to defend be mine, because mine is the one with the heir of the 3 brothers standing behind it, and because the ministry, when it learns whose vault you've drawn the line at, will understand the line means more than gold. He set both hands flat on the cold black stone, the first liberty he had taken, and the council permitted it. You don't trust me, you shouldn't. Trust is a wizard's word for a thing goblins are wise enough to replace with contracts. So write the contract, bind me to terms a goblin would consider fair, which I'm told is a thing more painful than any curse. I'll sign in the old grammar where a signature can't be broken. I'm not asking the nation to love me. I'm asking it to stop dying politely and offering it the most useful quarrel it's had in 900 years. Ragnarok looked down the long black table at his council, and the council looked back, and something passed among them in the goblin language that Harry did not speak and did not need to, because he could read a table as he read a dueling line by where the weight sat, and the weight, which had sat on caution when he entered, had moved. We will write the contract, Ragnarok said. It will be merciless, you will not enjoy it. I never enjoy anything, Harry said. It's one of my few consistent qualities. The sound moved along the black table again, and this time it was unmistakably a laugh, the dry, terrible laugh of creatures who had not found a wizard funny in a very long time, and the High Council of the Goblin Nation began, for the first time in 3 centuries, to plan a war. The contract took 11 days to write and was, as Ragnarok had promised, merciless. It bound Harry to terms a goblin considered fair, which meant it assumed bad faith on every line and closed every door through which a wizard had ever cheated the nation, and it ran to 40 pages of the old grammar, and Harry read every word, because a man who signs a goblin contract he has not read has signed away more than he knows. It granted the nation the right to defend his vault absolutely, and to make of its defense the example he had asked for. It granted Harry in exchange the recognition of the goblin nation as the heir of the 3 brothers, a standing no wizard had held since before the statute, which carried with it old rights the ministry had spent 3 centuries pretending were extinct. The right to treat with the nation as a sovereign rather than a customer, the right to passage through the deep places, the right to call once and only once, on the nation's full strength in a matter the council agreed touched the nation's honor. He signed it in the old grammar where a name is a binding and not a flourish, and the council signed, and the black stone table drank the signatures into itself, and the thing was done that no wizard had done in 900 years. Ragnarok walked him to the edge of the deep places himself, which the council noted because the old goblin walked no one anywhere. You will lose in the end, Ragnarok said at the threshold without rancor, a creature stating the long odds. Your kind always loses to its own institutions because you love them even as they devour you, but you will make the ministry bleed first, and you will make my nation's enemies remember why they once feared us, and a goblin asks little more of an alliance than a worthy quarrel and a profit at the close. He inclined his head a precise degree. Do not die the second time, heir of the brothers, it would be inconvenient to the contract. Draco Malfoy was easier to find than the goblins and harder to read, which Harry had expected, because gold sits where you put it and a frightened clever man moves. He found him in a wine merchant's in Hogsmeade on a wet evening, because Draco had become, in the years since the war, a dealer in things that wealthy people wanted and could not be seen acquiring. A discreet middleman in the grey market of a society that had publicly forsworn the old families, and privately still wished to buy what only the old families knew where to get. It was honest work by the loose standard of the grey market, and it had kept Draco fed and unnoticed, which was all Draco had wanted from the world since the world stopped wanting anything from him. And Harry watched him through the rain-streaked window for a while before he went in, taking the measure of what 3 years had made of the youth who had been unable to lower his wand on a tower. The shop bell rang. Draco looked up from a ledger, and his face performed the small professional welcome of a merchant, and then his face stopped performing anything at all because he had spent a childhood being taught to recognize dangerous men and a war learning the lesson properly, and he knew before he could have said how that the customer who had come in out of the rain was the most dangerous thing that had ever entered his shop. We're closing, Draco said. His hand had gone still on the ledger. You're not, Harry said. He turned the sign on the door without touching it, and the bolt slid home without touching it, and Draco watched both happen and went the color of the wet window. Hello, Malfoy, you're looking prosperous. Greymarket wine suits you better than the other thing did. You're dead, Draco's voice had gone careful. Potter, you're dead. There was a service my mother sent flowers, which I told her was insane, but she has a sentimental streak about people who didn't let me get murdered. You're dead. Everyone keeps telling me. Harry sat down on the customer's stool unhurried, and the unhurry did more to frighten Draco than any threat could have, because a man in a hurry can be waited out and a man with all the time in the world cannot. Sit down, Malfoy. I'm not here to hurt you. If I were, we wouldn't be talking. I'm here to offer you a job, and you're going to want to hear it because you spent 3 years being too clever for the small life they left you, and you know it. Draco sat. He sat the way a man sits when his legs have decided for him. What job, he said. You know, everyone the ministry threw away, Harry said. The families they pardoned and then quietly ruined. The half-bloods they squeezed out of the good positions when the safety statutes came in. The veterans who gave a hand or an eye for the war and got a medal and a stipend that the new provisions clawed back. You know them because you're one of them, and the discarded find each other, and you've built a gray market network out of the wreckage that runs on the one thing the ministry can't legislate, which is the loyalty of people who have nothing left to lose and a long memory for who lost it for them. He leaned forward. I want that network, not to own, to point. I'm going to take the machine apart that did this to all of you, and when it's apart I'm going to build something that can't do it again, and I need eyes and ears and quiet hands in every corner of a society that thinks I'm dead. You have them. You've had them for years and no idea what they were worth because you were thinking too small because they taught you to. Draco stared at him. The careful merchant was gone and so was the frightened boy, and what was left, Harry saw with a flicker of something he chose not to name, was the actual person underneath both, the sharp, pragmatic survivor who had kept a family alive through a war on the losing side by reading every room faster than anyone in it. Why me, Draco said. You hate me, you've hated me since we were 11. I don't hate you, I've never had the time. Hating you is a thing I did at school when I had the luxury of small enemies. Harry's voice did not change. I'm choosing you because you're the only person in Britain with the network I need and a grievance I can trust, and because you, unlike everyone I used to love, never once pretended to be on my side. You were honestly against me. There's a clean floor under that. I know exactly where I stand with a man who tried to have me killed and failed and grew up. I have no idea where I stand with the people who smiled at me and counted the votes, and I'm done finding out. He stood. You don't have to answer now, think about it. But think about it knowing that the machine that ruined your family is the same machine that broke me, and that I'm the first person in 3 years to walk into your shop and offer you a way to do something about it other than sell wine to the people who did it. Draco looked at the ledger and the rain on the window and the bolt that had slid home without a hand. My mother, he said. She's old. The ministry watches her soft visits the way they do if I do this and it goes wrong. Your mother lied to Voldemort's face to save my life in a forest, Harry said. I don't forget debts, Malfoy. It's the other half of not forgiving them. Narcissa Malfoy is already under my protection and has been since the hour I crossed back into this country, and she doesn't know it, and neither did you until now. Whatever you decide, that one's not a condition, that one's just paid. Draco was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought up a second glass and a bottle that did not have a price on it because it was not for sale, and he poured 2 measures of something the color of old gold and pushed one across the counter, and Harry, who never drank, picked it up because some offers are not about the wine. All right, Draco Malfoy said, tell me about the machine. Neville Longbottom cried, which Harry had not predicted, and then hugged him hard enough to crack a rib, which he had predicted even less, and then stepped back and looked at him properly and went quiet, because Neville had grown into a man who looked at things properly, and what he saw made the crying and the hug feel, in retrospect, like the last warmth of an old fire being banked. They met in the greenhouses at Hogwarts after dark, because Neville taught herbology now and the greenhouses were his, and the castle did not question its own professors walking their own glass houses at night. Among the dripping leaves and the things that moved when no one watched, Neville Longbottom looked at the friend the world had buried and understood, faster than Draco had, faster than the goblins, that the person in front of him was both Harry Potter and something Harry Potter had been forged into, and that the second thing was going to do something enormous, and that the question on the table was not whether but what side of it Neville wanted to be standing on. They lied, Neville said. It was not a question. At the trial, Ron lied. I never believed it, you know. The collapse, the curse, all of it, the version they sold. I knew you. You don't bring a house down on children. I said so. I said so to Hermione, to Ron's face at the Burrow, and Molly told me I was being disloyal to the family, and Ron wouldn't look at me, and Hermione gave me a speech about how the safest version of events wasn't always the truest, and the truest version wasn't always the safest, and somebody had to think about safety. He pulled a dead leaf off a plant with more force than the leaf required. I left. I haven't been back to the Burrow since. I teach my classes and I grow my plants and I tell myself there was nothing I could have done, and you've just walked into my greenhouse 3 years dead to prove I was right not to believe them, and I don't know whether to thank you or be sick. Be both, Harry said. It's the honest response. What do you want from me? Neville straightened. And don't tell me nothing, because you've come to a man you trust in the middle of the night, and you've never in your life done a thing without a reason. I want you to keep doing exactly what you're doing, Harry said. Teach, grow your plants, be the most trusted, most decent, least suspicious man in magical Britain, which you already are and which is worth more to me than any spell you could cast. I'm going to take the ministry apart, Neville. Slowly in public, piece by piece, until the country can't pretend it didn't see. And when it's apart, there's going to be a moment where the people of this country are frightened and rudderless and looking for someone to tell them it's going to be all right. And on that day, I'm going to need a man they trust completely to stand next to me and tell them I'm not the thing they were taught to fear. That man is you. You're not my soldier. I have soldiers now. You're my proof. You're the decent man's vote of confidence, and you can't be that if you're seen with me before the moment comes, so I'm asking you to do the hardest thing, which is to know everything and wait and say nothing until I send for you. Neville looked at him a long moment among the breathing leaves. You've thought about this, he said. All of it, every piece. You've got a plan that has a place in it for a herbology teacher. I've had 3 years and nothing to do but think. That's the part that frightens me, Neville said quietly. Not what you can do now. I can feel what you can do now. It's coming off you like heat off a stove. The part that frightens me is that you've planned it like a man planning a garden, years out, patient. And gardens are kind, Harry. They're the kindest thing I know, but they're built on the gardener deciding what lives and what gets pulled, and you've just told me you've decided. He nodded slowly, having frightened himself, and decided anyway. I'll wait. I'll say nothing. I'll be your proof. But I'm going to be the one who tells you when you've started pulling things that should have been let to grow. That's my condition. You get my trust and my silence, and in exchange you get a man who'll tell you to your face when you've gone wrong, and you'll listen because I'm the proof. And the day you stop listening to your own proof is the day you've become what they said you were. Harry looked at him, and for a moment among the dripping leaves, something passed over his face that the ice had not yet reached. That's the third time someone made that the price, he said. You, Luna, Andromeda, the 3 people I'd trust with my back, and all 3 of them independently have charged me the same coin, the right to tell me no. He almost smiled and did not, because he had not done it in 3 years and was not certain the machinery still worked. Either I chose my friends very well, Neville, or I'm more frightened of what I'm becoming than I let myself know. I haven't decided which. Keep the appointment open. I'll send for you. He let the world see what he was for the first time on a Tuesday in a market town in the Welsh borders because Draco's network had sent word that the ministry was going to take a girl there, and Harry had decided the time had come to make a statement that did not require his name. The girl was 19 and her name was Ira Price, and her crime, under the dangerous persons provision as it had been redefined that spring, was that her accidental magic had not stopped at the age it was supposed to stop. That under stress she still occasionally did things to the air around her that frightened her neighbors, and that a frightened neighbor had reported it, and that an enforcement unit of the kind the provision had created was coming to collect her for assessment. Which everyone in the gray market knew was a word that meant binding. The same procedure they had written for Harry, refined now in routine, applied to teenagers whose only offense was that their magic had a will of its own. She was, in other words, exactly what they had decided Harry was, a hole in the structure, a thing that could not be checked. And the structure had built a routine for filling such holes, and the routine was coming up the market road in the persons of 4 enforcement officers in a binding wagon. And it had done this a dozen times in towns like this one, and no one had stopped it, because no one could, because the whole point of the structure was that no one could. Harry stopped it. He was waiting in the market square when the unit arrived, under the cloak of Ignatus Peveril, which did not merely hide him but removed him from the notice of the world entirely, so that the 4 officers and the gathering townsfolk registered nothing in the space he occupied. In absence, they slid their attention over. The girl had been brought out into the square by 2 officers, her wrists already in the soft gray binding cords Harry knew the feel of, and she was not fighting because they had told her fighting only made the severing rougher, and she believed them because they had said it kindly. Her mother stood at the edge of the square with both hands pressed over her mouth. The town watched the way the crowd had watched Harry walk the cleared pavement, ordinary and frightened and decent and doing nothing, because nothing was the only thing the structure had ever left them to do. The lead officer raised his wand to begin the field binding that would make the girl safe to transport. He never finished the gesture. The wand left his hand, not flung but simply gone, lifted out of his grip by nothing and laid down in the dust 10 feet away, and the gray cords on the girl's wrists came open and fell, and the officer looked at his empty hand with the blank incomprehension of a man whose tool has betrayed him. And into the square, out of the absence where the world's attention would not go, Harry let himself be seen. He did not show his face. He had thought about this in the house above the sea, the grammar of a statement that needed to travel without a name attached, and he had built himself for it, a figure in dark robes under a hood that the eye could not quite resolve, taller than the truth, edged in a cold that the warm spring square felt as a dropping of the temperature, and when he spoke his voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Pitched in the old grammar so that it arrived in each listener as a thing they understood in their bones before they understood it in words. You will not take her, the figure said. The 4 officers did what trained men do, which was to attack the thing they did not understand, and they were good. They were the unit the provision had built to handle dangerous magic, and they cast well and fast and together, 4 curses converging on the hooded figure in a pattern designed to overwhelm a single wizard's defense. The pattern did not overwhelm anything. The curses crossed the square and arrived at the place where Harry stood and simply stopped, hanging in the air a hand's breadth from him, 4 points of vicious light frozen mid-flight because he had reached out with the grammar and told the space around himself that nothing would move through it that he had not invited, and the space had obeyed, the way the torches in the goblin chamber had leaned and the standing stones in the round room had failed. And the 4 officers stared at their own curses hanging dead in the air and understood, each at his own speed, that they had made a serious mistake. He let the curses fall. They dropped into the dust and went out. And then, without raising a hand, without a word the townsfolk could afterward repeat, he took the 4 enforcement officers apart, not their bodies, which he left entirely unmarked, but their capacity to be a threat, lifting them off their feet and holding them suspended and weightless above the square while the binding wagon's wheels turned themselves to rust and its bindings unbound and its official seals burned away to ash. A slow, methodical dismantling of every instrument the structure had sent. Performed in total silence while 4 of the ministry's hardest men hung in the air and discovered what the girl had been about to discover, what Harry had discovered in a round room, what it is to be entirely at the mercy of a power against which your training and your authority and your certainty are a child's drawing of a door held up against a real wall. He did not hurt them. That was the statement, the thing the grammar carried into every watching mind in the square. He could have. Every soul present understood with the certainty of bone that the hooded figure could have unmade the 4 officers as easily as it had rusted their wagon, and that it chose not to, and the choosing was more frightening than any cruelty would have been, because cruelty is a thing the structure understood and could prepare for, and mercy from a power it could not touch was a thing the structure had no answer to at all. He set the 4 officers down. They did not run because their legs would not yet do anything so decisive. They sat in the dust of the market square where a power had held them and let them go, and they looked up at the figure that the world's attention slid away from, and the figure looked back at all of them, officers and townsfolk and a 19-year-old girl rubbing her freed wrists, and it spoke once more. Tell them, the figure said, and the old grammar made it a thing they would not be able to keep themselves from doing, that there is a power in this country now that the ministry cannot bind and cannot see and cannot stop. Tell them it does not want their fear. Tell them it took nothing from you today that you needed and gave back everything they had taken. And tell the ones who write the laws that decide which children are too dangerous to be allowed their own magic that the next wagon they send, I will not be so gentle with the wagon. Then the absence closed over him, and he was gone, not disapparated, simply no longer a thing the square could attend to, and the 4 officers sat in the dust, and the girl's mother crossed the square at a dead run, and the town of which Harry never learned the name had witnessed the first public act of a campaign that would, before it ended, witness a great many more. The story traveled as he had built it to travel, underground in the gray market and the marginalized quarters and the kitchens of the discarded, passed hand to hand among exactly the people the ministry had taught itself to stop watching. And it grew in the telling, which he had also planned, because a legend that grows is a legend that recruits. Within a month the figure had a name, or rather it had the absence of one, which was better. The people who needed it called it nothing, or the gray man, or the one the wagons fear, and the not naming was its own protection and its own promise. Because you cannot smear a man who has no name, and you cannot reassure a frightened populace that a thing with no name has been safely killed. Within 2 months there had been 3 more interventions, each one chosen by Draco's network for maximum signal and minimum exposure, each one ending the same way: a piece of the structure's machinery dismantled, a discarded person restored what had been taken, 4 hard men sat down in the dust and sent home as witnesses, and no body ever and no name and no trace the ministry could follow. The discarded began to come to him. He had not asked them to. They found the network because desperate people are the finest intelligence service in any society, and they came with information and with skills and with the particular ferocious loyalty of those who have been thrown away and discovered, against all hope, that someone had come back for them. A former cursebreaker the safety statutes had pushed out of Gringotts brought Harry the bank's old defensive grammar. A veteran who had lost an arm at the battle and a pension to the provisions brought him the Auror office's current patrol patterns, because the veteran's brother still served and still talked. A house elf freed in the war and then quietly re-enslaved by a loophole brought him the gossip of a dozen great houses. He took them all in and he gave them all work, and he gave them all, more importantly, the thing the ministry had spent 3 years taking, which was the sense that they were no longer alone and no longer powerless. And Draco, watching the network swell from a handful of gray market contacts into something with the shape and reach of a shadow government, said to Harry one evening, with the dry precision of a man who had once expected to inherit a different kind of power. You understand, you're building a state, not a rebellion, a state. They've a leader they can't see, a treasury in Gringotts, an intelligence service made of everyone they threw out, and a founding myth about a hooded man who can't be bound. That's not a protest, Potter, that's a country waiting for its border to be drawn. I know, Harry said, that's the point. You don't defeat a state with a mob. You defeat it with a better state built quietly until the day the old one looks up and finds the people have already moved house. Draco was quiet a moment, turning his glass. My father, he said, spent his whole life trying to own the ministry, bought it, bribed it, served the man who tried to seize it, never worked because he was trying to own the building. You're not even looking at the building. You're taking the people out from under it one frightened family at a time. He drank. It's the most Slytherin thing I've ever seen, and you were a Gryffindor, and I find I resent that quite a lot. The hat wanted to put me in Slytherin, Harry said. I talked it out of the idea. I was 11 and I thought the houses meant something. He looked out at the dark. I've had time to reconsider a great many things I believed at 11. The first strike was a man named Corbin Yaxley's cousin, which was a joke the universe had made and Harry merely collected. His name was Hesper Yaxley, and he sat on the Wisengamot, and he had been one of the 9 votes that kept Kingsley Shacklebolt in office. And he had built his seat on the dangerous person's provision, championing each expansion, each downward redefinition of who counted as a danger, and he had grown rich doing it, because every vault the provision seized passed through a ministry trust that Hesper Yaxley happened to administer. And a fraction of every seizure happened to lose itself somewhere between the seizing and the accounting. It was not a large fraction. Hesper Yaxley was a careful man. But it was 11 vaults across 3 years, and the fraction added up, and Harry, who had spent a month with Draco's ledgers and the Goblin's meticulous records of what had gone in versus what had come out, could account for every nut of it. He did not expose it himself. That was the elegance, the part Hermione would have recognized if she had been able to bear to look. A dead man cannot testify, and an accusation from nowhere is easy to bury, and so Harry did not make an accusation. He made the discrepancy findable. He arranged, through Draco's quiet hands and the Goblin's impeccable books, that an ordinary ministry auditor doing an ordinary annual review of the seizure trust would stumble, all on her own, over a number that did not reconcile and would pull a thread, and the thread would lead exactly where the record said it led, with no fingerprints on it but Hesper Yaxley's own. The Goblins were delighted to cooperate. Goblins consider the misappropriation of money held in trust to be very nearly the only true sin, and the chance to destroy a wizard for it with documentation was a gift they would have paid for. It took 6 weeks. Harry watched it unfold from a distance through the eyes of Draco's network and the dry reports of the Goblin Council, and he did nothing further because the beauty of a true thing made findable is that it does not need to be pushed, it only needs to stop being hidden. The auditor found the number led to the thread. The thread led to a quiet, horrified review, and then a less quiet one, and then on a gray morning to 2 Aurors arriving at Hesper Yaxley's door with a warrant. While the prophet, which had once printed Harry Potter's face under the word dangerous, printed Hesper Yaxley's face under the word theft, and the country read that one of the architects of its safety had been robbing the very vaults he seized to keep it safe, and felt the first small lurch of a faith beginning to slip. Kingsley Shacklebolt lost a vote that week. He did not know yet that he had lost it to a dead man. He knew only that one of his 9 had become a liability overnight, exposed by an audit no one had ordered, ruined by his own records, and that the timing was strange, and that the Goblin Nation had chosen that exact season to harden its line on the seizure of vaults to a degree the Ministry had not seen in living memory, refusing the 12th sequestration outright and in writing, citing charters 300 years unmentioned. Kingsley was a careful man too. He did not believe in coincidence. He believed in causes, and he sat in the warm office with the 2 steady fire and looked at 2 events that should not have been connected and felt, for the first time since a binding facility had become a ruin 3 years before, the specific cold of a man who suspects the ground he is standing on is not as solid as the survey claimed. He called for the file on the binding of Harry Potter. He read it again, the official version, the dangerous instability, the tragic incompatibility, the ruin of an apparatus that had operated for 200 years. He read the part where the body was never recovered because the procedure, the report said, left no body to recover. He had signed off on that sentence himself 3 years ago because it had been convenient, and a minister learns to let convenient things lie. He looked at it now and found it had stopped being convenient and started being a question, and the question was very simple and very cold, and it was the question that would govern the rest of his time in office. What if there was no body because there was nothing to recover, and what if there was nothing to recover because the prisoner had simply walked out? Far to the north, in a house that had no name, Harry Potter received Draco's report and the Goblin's figures and read that a minister had called for an old file, and understood that the second phase had begun precisely on schedule, that the hand had closed around the loose thread and the structure had finally felt it. And he set the reports down and looked out at the gray sea doing its patient work on the rock, and let himself, for one moment, feel the cold, clean satisfaction of a plan meeting the world exactly where he had aimed it. Then he put the moment away because there was a great deal still to do, and a man who savors the first move has already lost the discipline that wins the last one. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Old Debt's Rita Skeeter had built her life on the principle that everyone has a secret, and she had been right about everyone except herself. Harry came to her on a wet autumn night in her flat above a stationer, S in Diagon Alley, where she wrote the columns that had buried him, and he came openly, without the cloak, because she of all people had earned the privilege of seeing the face of the thing she had spent 3 years inventing. She was at her desk with the enchanted quill scratching out tomorrow's poison, and she looked up at the sound of a chair settling that should not have settled, and she saw a dead man sitting in it, and she did the most professional thing Harry had ever seen anyone do under pressure. She reached for a fresh sheet of parchment. "Don't," Harry said, "you won't be writing this one." "Harry Potter," her quill had gone still. Her painted face worked through shock into calculation at a speed he almost admired, because Skeeter was, underneath the venom, a genuinely formidable mind that had decided the most profitable use of itself was the ruin of better people. Alive, after all this time, do you have any idea what this is worth? The resurrection of the boy who lived, exclusive, every word from the man himself. You're an unregistered animagus, Harry said. A beetle, you've been one for decades. You used it to listen at windows and in handbags and under the doors of every private room in Britain, and you built a career on what you overheard, and the registration of animagi is a serious matter under the law, and the unregistered ones get Azkaban, not a fine. He watched the calculation stall. Hermione knew. She caught you in our 4th year and blackmailed you with it and let you go because she was 14 and thought leverage was the same as justice. I'm not 14. And I've spent 3 years with people who keep better records than a schoolgirl with a jam jar. The quill dropped. Skeeter's face had stopped calculating. But that's the small thing, Harry went on, and his voice did not rise, because the things he had come to say did not need volume, they needed only to be true and to be said by a dead man in a chair. The unregistered animagi is the leverage I'd use on an ordinary venal journalist. You're not ordinary. You're the most successful liar in the country, and you didn't do it alone, and that's the thing I actually came for. You've been fed for years. The Ministry's Office of Public Confidence has been handing you the stories it wanted printed and the angles it wanted taken, and you printed them because a fed journalist is a rich journalist, and in exchange you've let the government write the country's opinion of every person it wanted to ruin, including me. He set a folder on her desk. It was thick. Draco Malfoy's network, 6 months of work, every payment, every meeting, every story the Office of Public Confidence placed through you and how much they paid for the placing. Your byline on the Ministry's lies, documented, dated, and ready to go to print under your own rules of evidence. Skeeter looked at the folder and did not touch it. You're going to destroy me, she said. It was not a question. No, Harry said. I'm going to do something you'll find much worse. I'm going to make you tell the truth. She fought it at first because 3 decades of venom do not reverse on a single wet night, but Harry had not come to persuade her. He had come to restructure her incentives, and he was very good at it now. The arrangement he offered was simple, and it was a noose dressed as a lifeline, which was a craft he had learned from watching it done to him. Skeeter would keep her freedom, her flat, her quill, and her byline. In exchange, she would print beginning the following week a series. Not lies in his favor, which would smell wrong and travel badly, but the documented truth, which had the advantage of being unanswerable. The truth about the seizure trust in Hesper Yaxley, fuller than the first thin account. The truth about the binding procedure and how many children it had been applied to since it stopped being reserved for Dark Lords. The truth about the Office of Public Confidence and how the country's opinions had been bought and placed, which she would know better than anyone because she had been the one cashing the checks. And eventually, when the ground was ready, the truth about a raid at Cotter Mire and a South Rune that was never anchored. You want me to take down the people who made me, Skeeter said. Do you understand what they'll do to me when they realize? I understand exactly what they'll do because they did it to me and I survived it, and you will too because you'll have the one thing I didn't. Harry tapped the folder. A protector they can't see and can't bind and can't stop. The gray man, Rita, the one the wagons fear. You've been wondering for months who he is and whether you dared try to find out. You're looking at him. And he is offering you the only second act in journalism that ends with you remembered as something other than the woman who helped a government eat its own heroes. He stood. You spent 3 years writing the story the Ministry wanted. I'm offering you the story that's actually true and exclusive no one else can run, and the protection to survive running it. You're a venal woman, Rita, but you're not a stupid one. Do the arithmetic. It's the only kind of prayer your sort ever answers. Skeeter did the arithmetic. He watched her do it, the formidable mind turning over a future in which the Ministry's tame attack quill became the instrument of the Ministry's exposure. And he saw the moment she understood that he had offered her not just survival, but the thing venal people want most under all the wanting, which was to matter, to be the author of the story rather than its hired hand, and he saw her decide. The Cotter piece, she said. The South Rune. When that runs, it ends Ron Weasley. You know that? The golden boy of the Auror office, the friend who told the hard truth, finished, over a rune he didn't set. Her painted eyes were sharp on him, the journalist scenting the thing under the story. That's personal for you. All the rest of this is strategy. I can see the strategy. It's beautiful, but that one's personal. I've made my living reading what's personal, so tell me because I'll write it better if I know. Do you want him exposed or do you want him destroyed? They're different stories and they need different sentences. Harry was quiet for a moment in the lamplight of the flat where his ruin had been composed. Write it true, he said. Just true, don't reach for a single adjective. The truth is enough to destroy him, and if I have to dress it up to do the work, then I've become you, and I'd rather he survived. He went to the door. That's the difference between us, Rita, and it's the only difference that's ever mattered. You decide what you want a thing to mean, and then you arrange the facts to mean it. I'm going to give the country the facts and let it decide for itself what they mean. I think that frightens the Ministry more than any lie I could tell, because they've spent 3 years certain the public can't be trusted with the truth, and I'm about to bet everything that they're wrong. The series ran, and the country changed its mind in the slow, lurching, irreversible way that a country does when it has been lied to for a long time and the lies begin all at once to come apart at the seams. It did not happen in a day. Harry had not expected it to and would have distrusted it if it had. The first piece on the seizure trust the country half knew already and absorbed with a grumble. The second on the binding procedure and the children landed harder because the country had not known about the children, had not let itself wonder what assessment meant when applied to a frightened 19-year-old. And the photograph Skeeter ran of soft gray binding cords on young wrists, of a procedure the Wisengamot had certified as mercy, did a thing to the public stomach that no editorial could have done. Third piece on the Office of Public Confidence was the one that turned the corner because it was the piece in which the country learned that its own opinions had been bought, that the things it had been certain of had been placed there by men who were paid to place them, and there is no betrayal a free people forgives more slowly than the discovery that its certainty was for sale. By the time the series reached its fourth week, the Ministry understood it was under attack and could not locate the attacker. They could see Skeeter. They could not touch her because every attempt to silence her became, by her own prearranged design, the next day's headline, and because the Office of Public Confidence, the very instrument they would have used to discredit her, was the subject of the expose and so could not be deployed without proving her right. They could see the goblins hardening every line. They could see a Wisengamot vote slipping, and then another, Kingsley's 9 becoming 7 becoming 5. They could see the legend of the Grey Man spreading from the marginalized quarters into the ordinary streets. No longer a story the discarded told each other, but a thing respectable people half believed. A power that protected the people the Ministry preyed on, that took nothing and gave back what had been taken, and they could feel the dreadful logic of it closing on them, that a frightened public will forgive almost anything in a protector and almost nothing in a thief. And that the Ministry had spent 3 years carefully arranging to look like the thief. The thing that frightened the Ministry most was not the Grey Man, who at least was a single target they could imagine destroying. It was what the legend of him did to ordinary people who were not a target at all. In a fishing village in the far north, an enforcement unit arrived to collect an old woman whose weather sense had curdled, over a long widowhood, into small storms she could not always govern, and the village did a thing it had never done in the memory of the provision. It stood in the road. Not with wands, most of them barely had the training to light one, but with bodies, the whole village between the wagon and the old woman's door, and the unit's commander, a careful man, looked at the wall of fishermen and their wives and understood that to take the old woman now he would have to curse his way through 40 people who had committed no crime but standing in front of children in a village where everyone owned an owl and a memory, and he waited, and he found he could not. The unit withdrew. It was the first time, it was not the last. It spread because it worked, and it worked because of a calculation that had quietly reversed. For 3 years the arithmetic of the provision had rested on isolation, on the certainty that a frightened family facing the wagons faced them alone, that the neighbors would keep their doors shut and be grateful it was not their door, and the whole machinery of safety had run on that grateful silence. The legend of the Grey Man broke the arithmetic. It did not break it by making people brave, exactly. It broke it by making them uncertain, by putting into every commander's mind, as he raised his wand to begin a field binding, the new and unbearable possibility that the world's attention might be on him, that an absence in the corner of the square might resolve into a hooded figure, that he might be the next man sat down in the dust and sent home to explain himself. A machine that depends on no one stopping it cannot survive the suspicion that someone might. Harry had built it to do exactly this, and he watched it do it through Draco's reports with the cold attention of a man confirming a hypothesis. And he was careful, very careful, not to let himself enjoy it too much, because Andromeda's warning sat in him like a stone he had agreed to carry, that this was how every tyrant in history had started, a wrong that wanted righting and a man certain he was the one to right it. And that the surest sign of the road going bad would be the day he began to love the watching too much. He intervened less often now on purpose. The legend had grown large enough to do the work without him, and a power that is everywhere is more frightening than a power that is anywhere, and a hooded man who appears at every wagon is a man who can be predicted and trapped, while a hooded man who might appear at any wagon is a god the structure cannot plan around. He let the uncertainty do the labor. He spent the saved hours on the next pieces of the demolition and on the house, and on a moor in Devon where a 7-year-old was learning long division and wanted urgently to show him. The Ministry tried to answer the legend with a legend of its own. The Office of Public Confidence, wounded but not yet dead, attempted to recast the Grey Man as a dark wizard in the old mold, a new Voldemort gathering the disaffected, a danger that justified every provision twice over. It was a sound strategy, and it failed completely, because the country had just learned, in Skeeter's documented serial, that the Office of Public Confidence was the very instrument that had lied to them for years, and a populace does not take its fears on credit from a source it has caught counterfeiting. Every Ministry attempt to paint the Grey Man dark only reminded the public who was holding the brush. The harder they pushed the monster, the more the monster looked like the one thing the Ministry could not afford him to look like, which was a man the people had begun cautiously in the privacy of their own kitchens to hope was real. Kingsley Shacklebolt called an emergency session of his inner circle, and Draco's network reported every word of it to Harry within the hour, because 2 of the people in the room owed their continued liberty to the Grey Man and had decided where their loyalty now lived. The Ministry tried to trap him in the 6th week of the series, which told Harry they had grown desperate enough to be predictable. They built the trap around a wagon. They had worked out from the pattern of the interventions that the Grey Man came when an enforcement unit moved against one of the marginalized. And so they staged a movement, a wagon and a unit dispatched to a hamlet in the Pennines to collect a half-blood metalworker whose forge did things to iron that frightened his neighbors, and they let the dispatch be overheard, fed it gently into the channels they knew the grey market listened to, and then they filled the hamlet with the best the Auror office had. 24 of them, layered in concealment, anchored to a containment ward of the newest design, a ward built specifically to do to the Grey Man what the binding apparatus had failed to do, to hold him in a sealed volume of space until they could end him properly. Harry knew it was a trap before Draco's network confirmed it, because the dispatch had been too easy to overhear, and a thing that wants to be found is a thing that has teeth. He went anyway. He went because the metalworker was real and frightened and would be taken if no one came, and because a campaign built on protecting the discarded does not get to decline the dangerous rescues and keep the legend, and because he had spent 3 years becoming a thing that could walk into the Auror office's best trap and make the trap the lesson. He came at dusk, under the cloak of Ignatus, into a hamlet that pretended to be empty and was not. He found the metalworker in his cottage with 2 officers already at the door, and he did the small part first, the part that mattered, lifting the man and his wife and their tools out of the cottage and away through the deep places to a safe house the network kept, before the trap had registered that its bait had been taken. Then he let the cloak fall and stood in the single street of the hamlet in the failing light, the hooded figure the ministry had built a ward to catch, and he let them spring it. The containment ward came down like a struck bell. It sealed the street end to end, a dome of force keyed to hold him, and the 24 Aurors rose out of their concealment all at once, and it was, Harry acknowledged, good work, the best the modern office could do, a coordinated strike by 24 trained wizards inside a purpose-built cage. Against the duelist he had been at 17, it would have been overwhelming. Against the thing the house above the sea had forged, it was a demonstration, and the only question was whose. He did not fight them spell for spell. That was the vocabulary, and he had left the vocabulary behind. He reached into the containment ward with the old grammar and read it, the whole architecture of it. In the half-second it took the first curses to leave the first wands, and he found the assumption the ward was built on, which was that the thing inside it drew its power from the same root every wizard drew from, the warm root the binding apparatus had been built to sever. And he understood that the men who designed the ward had made the same error the men who designed the apparatus had made. They had built a cage for a wizard, and he had stopped being only a wizard in a round room 3 years before. He took the ward apart from the inside. He did not break it, which would have been loud and crude. He persuaded it in the grammar of its own construction that it had already done its work and could rest, and the dome of force that had sealed the street simply decided it was finished and dissolved into the dusk. And the 24 Aurors who had been so certain of their cage found themselves standing in an open street with the most dangerous wizard in Britain, no longer caged, looking at them with an attention that none of them would be able to describe afterward without going quiet. What followed was not a battle, it was a sorting. He moved through the 24 of them the way water moves through a fence, never quite where their curses arrived, and as he moved he disarmed them, not flung wands but lifted ones, each wand drawn gently out of each hand and set down in a neat row along the street's single gutter. And where a man fought to keep his wand, Harry took the man's feet from under him instead, weightless, a body lifted and laid down in the dirt unhurt and unarmed. And within 90 seconds the Auror office's finest 24 were sitting or lying in the street of a Pennine hamlet, disarmed, unmarked, and entirely reorganized in their understanding of what was possible, and Harry had not raised his voice or his hand or done a single thing that left a mark a healer could find. He stood among them in the dusk. He let them see again that he had hurt none of them, that he could have unmade the lot and had instead merely undressed them of their authority and laid it in a gutter, and he spoke in the old grammar that arrived in the bone. "Go back to the man who sent you," Harry said, "and tell him what you have already worked out, which is that there is no ward he can build that holds me and no number of you that stops me, and that I have now twice declined to kill a single one of you, and ask him why. Ask him why a thing the ministry has spent 3 years calling a monster keeps sending its enemies home alive. And when he can't answer, ask yourselves which of us is the monster, the one who took nothing from you tonight but your certainty, or the one who sent 24 men to die catching a thing he'd already failed to bind once and lied about." He took up the cloak of Ignatus, and the street's attention slid off him, and he was gone, and 24 Aurors gathered their wands out of the gutter in silence and went back to London to deliver a report that the Minister for Magic read 3 times and did not show to anyone, because there are some defeats a government cannot afford to have written down. After the Pennines, Harry called his people together because the trap had been the ministry's answer to a question, and the answer told him it was time to ask the next one. They met in the long hall of the house above the sea, the only place in Britain warded thoroughly enough to hold a conversation the ministry would have given a great deal to overhear. Draco was there, lean and sharp and entirely at home now in a role his father had wanted and never understood, with a ledger that was no longer about wine. A goblin of the Deep Council sat at the end of the table as Ragnarok's voice, silent and watchful, present because the nation's contract entitled it to know how its quarrel proceeded. The cursebreaker the statutes had ruined was there, and the one-armed veteran and 2 others the network had raised into command, and Luna sat in the window with her feet up, reading a book upside down, which Harry had stopped questioning because she was always somehow on the right page. They sprang their best trap and lost 24 men and a new war design, Draco said, and they can't tell anyone because the report makes them look helpless, and a government that looks helpless is a government with a shelf life. The vote's slipping, Skeeter's series is doing more damage than any rebellion could. The provinces are refusing the wagons on their own now, no gray man required. He set the ledger down. By every measure, we're winning. Which is exactly when men like us make the mistake men like us always make, which is mistaking the moment the enemy is losing for the moment the enemy is beaten. Draco met his eyes. Kingsley Shacklebolt is a careful man and a cornered one, and cornered careful men do not surrender, Potter, they escalate. He's about to stop fighting the gray man as a criminal and start fighting him as a war, and when he does, the gloves we've all enjoyed him wearing come off, and the people in this room and the people we protect become targets in a way they haven't been yet. I want everyone to understand that the easy part is ending, not the hard part. We spent a year taking pieces off the board. We're about to find out what the board does when it realizes the game is real. The hall was quiet. The veteran spoke in the flat voice of a man who had been to a war and did not romanticize the next one. Then we should hit him first, hard, end it before he can escalate. No, Harry said, and the hall turned to him. That's the trap inside the win. If I move on the ministry first openly with force, then every story the Office of Public Confidence ever told about me comes true in a single afternoon. The dark wizard gathering the disaffected, seizing the state by violence. I'd win the building and lose the country, and a man who rules a country that fears him rules it the way the one I killed tried to, and I've read where that ends. He stood and walked the length of the long hall, and the firelight bent its degree toward him as it always did now. We let him escalate. We let him be the one who turns a political defeat into a war. We let him send the order to hunt me with everything he has, and we make sure the country knows he sent it, and then when he reaches for force first, the country watches its frightened government try to murder the only power that ever protected it, and it makes up its own mind which of us it wants. I don't take the ministry. I let the ministry discredit itself so completely that the country hands it to me to be rid of it. That's slower and it's harder, and it requires every one of you to hold your nerve while he comes for us, but it's the only version where what I build afterward isn't built on the same fear they built on. We're not winning a war, we're winning an argument and then inheriting the building the argument empties. Draco looked at him a long moment and then he laughed short and dry. You really did spend 3 years thinking about this. I had the time, Harry said. Hold your nerve. He's about to make the worst decision of his career, and I need all of you alive and patient when he does. There's one debt I have to settle in person before he gives the order. After that, we let him come. He went to Ron last before the Cotter piece ran because there was a thing he needed to do in person, and he was not certain until he was in the room whether it was mercy or cruelty, and he had stopped pretending to himself that he always knew the difference. Ron Weasley had an office now with his name on the door and a portrait on the wall, a commissioned portrait of himself in Auror robes that he had hung where visitors would see it. And Harry came to the office at night, through wards that did not notice him, and sat in the visitor's chair in the dark and waited. And when Ron came in the next morning and turned up the lamps and found a dead man sitting under his own commissioned portrait, he made a sound that was not a word and went for his wand. And his wand was not where he reached because Harry had moved it to the desk an hour before. Sit down, Ron, Harry said. I'm not going to hurt you. If I were going to hurt you, I'd have done it 3 years ago in the mire when you watched a house come down on a cellar and decided the simplest thing to do with the truth was to bury it under me. I had a curse that ends things. I used it once that night on a man who'd earned it. I didn't use it on you. I want you to sit with that for a second because it's the most important thing in this room. I have always been able to kill you, and I never have, and I'm not going to start now, and that is going to turn out to be so much worse for you than if I did. Ron sat. He had gone the color of ash. He looked older than 3 years should have made him, and heavier, and there was something in his face that Harry had not expected, and that complicated the cold, clean thing he had come to do, which was that Ron looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time, like a man who carried a stone he could not set down. You're dead, Ron said. We buried, there was a service. Everyone keeps telling me about the service. Harry leaned forward. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, Ron, and then I'm going to leave, and I'm never going to do you the courtesy of being in a room with you again. Next week, the prophet runs a piece on Cotter Mire, the truth. The south room you never anchored, the cellar you told me was empty, the testimony you rehearsed in a mirror until you could say I don't know what you're talking about and make it sound like grief. All of it documented in Rita Skeeter's byline under her new rules where she only prints what she can prove. And she can prove all of it because I've spent 3 years in a goblin's fortune making sure she can. Ron's hands had begun to shake on the desk. Harry, when it runs, you'll lose this office, the portrait, the story you tell in pubs about the friend you had to be honest about. You'll lose the Auror office because they'll need someone to throw to the public and you'll be the cheapest thing they have to throw. You'll lose Hermione's respect, what's left of it, because she spent 3 years telling herself her framework was mercy and yours was honesty, and she'll learn in print that yours was just a lie, and she'll never look at you the same, and you know it because you've watched her stop looking at you already. Harry's voice did not rise through any of it. And you'll keep your life and your freedom and your name because I'm not going to take those, and you'll get to spend the next 40 years being the man who sold his best friend to a machine for an office with his name on the door. That's the sentence, Ron, not Azkaban, just the truth and a long life to live inside it. Ron was crying now silently, the tears of a man who has been waiting 3 years for a bill to come due and has just heard the knock. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said. I swear to God, Harry, I didn't. It was the rune, I panicked. I didn't set it and the house came down and I was so scared, and then the prophet was there and everyone was so sure, and it was easier to let them be sure, and then it was too late to be anything but sure with them, and I told myself you'd be all right, you were always all right, you were Harry Potter, you'd land on your feet. He stopped. And then you didn't, and then you were dead, and I've carried that every day. I know, Harry said, and for a moment something moved under the ice because he did know he had known Ron Weasley since they were 11 and frightened on a train. And the figure falling apart under the commissioned portrait was the same boy who had followed him past a three-headed dog and into chamber and through a war, and the knowing was the hardest part of the whole campaign, harder than the goblins, harder than the round room. Here's the thing, Ron, I believe you didn't mean it. I believe you've carried it. And it doesn't matter, that's what no one tells you about being on the receiving end. The intention doesn't reach me. Whether you meant to bury me or only let it happen because it was easier, I spent 3 years in a house above the sea learning to be a thing the world should fear because of a rune you didn't set. Your guilt is real and it's irrelevant. It's a thing that happens inside you. It was never going to dig me out of the ground. He stood. Ron looked up at him wrecked, and Harry looked down at the friend who had broken him, and he did the cruelest and kindest thing in his power, which was to tell the truth without softening it and without sharpening it either. I forgave a lot of people a lot of things once, Harry said. It used to be the thing I was best at. They cured me of it, you mostly. So I'm not going to forgive you because I can't anymore. The part that did that is gone, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make either of us feel better. But I'm not going to kill you, and I'm not going to break you any further than the truth breaks you, and that's the most mercy I have left, and you're getting all of it. Read the prophet next week. And then go and live, Ron. It's the sentence I'd have given anything for 3 years ago. Try not to waste it the way I'd have wanted to. He left Ron Weasley crying under his own portrait, and he did not look back, and out in the corridor he stood for a moment with one hand flat against the cold stone wall, and then he took it away and went to finish the rest. He went to Devon that night after Ron because he had made a rule with himself that he would never leave a cold thing as the last thing of a day, and the reckoning under the commissioned portrait had been the coldest thing he had done since he came back, and he could feel where it had taken something out of him and put ice in the hole. Luna was at Andromeda's table when he came through the wards, which did not surprise him because Luna had taken to being wherever he would most need someone to tell him the truth, and she looked up at him over a cup of something that steamed, and she looked at him for a long moment with her pale, direct eyes, and then she said to Andromeda, not to him, "He's done the thing to Ron, you can see it. There's a new piece of him gone to ice tonight." "I can see it," Andromeda said. She was darning a sock that belonged to a 7-year-old and did not look up. "Sit down, Harry, you look like a man who's been doing arithmetic with people in it." He sat. Teddy was asleep upstairs. The house held the particular quiet of a child put to bed. Harry put his hands flat on the table and looked at them, and the two women let him be quiet because they had both learned that he would say the true thing eventually if no one rushed him toward a false one. "I told him I couldn't forgive him," Harry said at last. "And I meant it. That's the part that's bothering me, not that I said it, that it was true. There used to be a part of me that could forgive anyone anything, and I went looking for it tonight in that office with him crying in front of me, and it wasn't there. They didn't just break my trust. They broke the thing that does the forgiving. And I don't know if it grows back or if I've become a man who simply doesn't have it anymore, and I can't tell from the inside whether that's an injury or a choice." Luna reached across the table and put her hand over both of his, which she did rarely, and which therefore meant a great deal. "It's an injury," she said. "I want you to hear me say that because you're going to spend the next while trying to decide it's a choice. Because a choice is something you can be proud of, and an injury is something that was done to you, and you'd rather have done it to yourself than admit they did it to you. But it's an injury, Harry. They cut the forgiving out of you. And the dangerous thing, the thing I'm here to tell you, is that an injury you decide to keep stops being an injury and becomes a shape. You can let the wound close into a man who can't forgive and call it strength, and that man wins everything you're trying to win and loses the warm room without ever noticing the door shut." Her eyes did not leave his. "You asked me to tell you when you've gone too cold. This isn't too cold yet, but it's the night I started watching for it. I wanted you to know that so that when I tell you later, you'll know I didn't decide it lightly." Harry turned his hands over under hers and held them for a moment. "Keep watching," he said. "Don't stop. Whatever I become, don't stop watching." "I won't." Luna took her hands back and wrapped them around her cup again. "Andromeda made a cake. It's a terrible cake. She's a wonderful woman and a terrible baker, and Teddy decorated it, which made it worse and also the best cake in England. You should have a piece before you go back to being frightening. It's very hard to stay frightening with that cake in you. That's why I make her bring it." He had a piece of the terrible cake at the table in Devon where nobody wanted anything from him, and it was exactly as promised, the worst and the best cake in England, and the warm room in the middle of the ice stayed lit for one more night, which was, he was learning, the only way it ever stayed lit, one night at a time on purpose, against the cold he was choosing to carry into every other room he entered. The corridor piece ran on a Thursday, and it ended Ron exactly as Harry had said it would. And the country read it and felt the last of the old story come apart, because if they had lied about the South Rune, then they had lied about the curse, and if they had lied about the curse, then they had lied about the monster, and a public that has caught its government in one buried truth begins all at once to dig for the others. The ministry threw Ron to them, as Harry had predicted, a resignation dressed as a reckoning, the Auror office cleaning its own house, and it bought them nothing because the public had stopped accepting sacrifices, having learned what the sacrifices were worth. The Wisengamot vote that week was the worst of Kingsley's tenure. Two more of his coalition crossed the floor. The opposition, sensing blood, began to ask in open session the question the minister had been asking himself alone in the warm office for months, which was whether the prisoner Harry Potter had truly died in the binding 3 years before, or whether the ministry had buried a man who was, even now, taking his methodical and patient revenge on every soul who had signed the order. Kingsley did not answer the question in open session. He answered it in private that night, by doing the thing Harry had been waiting for him to do, the thing that meant the campaign had passed out of its quiet phase and into its open one. He summoned the Department of Mysteries and the Auror office and the small ruthless core of people who would do what had to be done without writing it down, and he gave the order to find the Grey Man by any means, and to bring an end to him that this time would leave a body, because a minister who has buried a man once and watched him claw his way back out of the grave has learned that the only safe enemy is a thoroughly demonstrated corpse. Far to the north, in a house that had no name, Harry read the order in Draco's careful hand, and he set it down. And he looked out at the sea throwing itself at the rock, patient, certain, in no hurry at all, and he understood that the world that had broken him had just decided to try to break him a second time, and that this time it would come with everything it had, and that this was exactly what he had spent 3 years preparing the ground to make it do. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The greater good. Kingsley gave the order, and the war began the way the careful man had decided it would, not with a strike at the Grey Man who could not be found, but with a strike at the people the Grey Man loved who could. They went for Andromeda first. Harry had known they would, because a cornered, careful man reaches for leverage before he reaches for a fight, and there was no leverage in the country worth more than a tired woman raising the orphan of 2 war heroes on a moor in Devon. The soft visit stopped being soft. The unit came at dawn with a writ declaring Andromeda Tonks an unfit guardian on grounds of association with a dangerous element. The dangerous element unnamed in the writ because they could not yet write the name they suspected, and they came to take Teddy into the care of the ministry, which was a word that had stopped meaning care some years before. They did not reach the door. Andromeda's wards were her own work, and they were old and clever, but it was not the wards that stopped the unit. It was Creature, who had been set to watch the moor since the hour Harry crossed back into the country, and who met the unit on the lane with the cold fury of an elf whose family had kept the kind of secrets that do not go in floor plans, and who held them, alone, an ancient house elf against 6 trained wizards, long enough for the thing Creature had also been instructed to do, which was to call. Harry came across the deep places in the time it takes to decide to, and he arrived on the lane in Devon in the grey dawn light, without the cloak, without disguise, as himself, because the moment a writ was raised against Teddy Lupin was the moment the campaign's careful anonymity stopped being worth more than the message his face would send, and the 6 wizards of the unit looked at the dead man standing on the lane between them and the cottage and understood, each at his own speed, that they had been sent to the one place in Britain where the Grey Man's restraint did not apply. He did not kill them. He wanted to. He stood on the lane with a writ in the lead officer's hand demanding the body of a 7-year-old, and the thing in the deep dark stirred at the edge of his attention, offered the way it always offered, never urging, only present, and the offer was very simple and would have left 6 bodies on a Devon lane, and a message no ministry would ever again misread. He looked at the offer, he thought of a fist closing around 2 of his fingers, he thought of a piece of terrible cake. And he declined it by the hardest act of will of the entire campaign, and instead he took the 6 of them apart as he had taken the 2 dozen apart in the penance, weightless, disarmed, unhurt, laid down in the wet grass of the lane, and when they were down and unarmed he crouched by the lead officer and spoke to him quietly without the grammar in his own voice so that the man would know it was a person and not a legend telling him this. "You were sent to take a child," Harry said. "I want you to carry something back to the man who sent you, and I want you to carry it in your own words, because you're going to remember this morning for the rest of your life, and I want the remembering to be accurate. Tell Kingsley Shacklebolt that I have let his men go home alive every time he has sent them, twice in the penance, 4 times before that, and now 6 of you on this lane, and that I am going to keep doing it, because I am not the thing he told the country I was. But tell him also that the child was the line. Tell him that I built a great deal of patience into this, years of it, and that all of it, every scrap, sat on one side of a line and the child was the other side, and he just sent 6 men across it. Tell him I declined this morning to make him pay what that costs. Tell him I will not decline twice." He let the man up. The unit went back to London, and the writ against Teddy Lupin was quietly withdrawn within the day, not because Kingsley had grown a conscience, but because he had received the message and understood that he had, in his desperation, found the one move that turned the country's frightened, restrained protector into something with no restraint left at all, and that a wise man does not test such a thing twice. The careful man had made his first genuine mistake, and he knew it, and the knowledge did to him what such knowledge does to careful men. It made him reckless, because a man who has glimpsed the edge of the cliff often decides the only way off it is forward. He stayed at the cottage after the unit had gone, longer than was wise, because his hands would not quite settle and he did not want Teddy to see them unsettled. Andromeda put the child back to bed. The dawn raid had woken him, and he had watched the lane from an upstairs window with the frank interest of a 7-year-old who did not yet understand that the men in the lane had come for him. And Harry had needed Andromeda to take him upstairs and tell him a version of the morning that a child could hold, because Harry himself could not have managed a single gentle word while the offer from the deep dark still sat warm in his chest, declined but not gone. The 6 bodies he had not made lying in his imagination on the wet grass with terrible clarity. Luna found him in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table, holding them still by main force. "You wanted to kill them," she said. It was not an accusation. She sat down across from him and put her chin in her hands and regarded him with her pale, steady attention. "On the lane. I felt it from the garden. The world went very thin around you, thinner than I've ever felt it, and then it came back. You had the door open. You were going to do it. They came for Teddy." His voice was level and the levelness cost him. 6 men with a writ for 7-year-old, and the thing I carry offered, and for about a second and a half, Luna, I had decided. I had genuinely decided. There were going to be 6 dead men on that lane and I was going to feel nothing. And the only reason there aren't is that I thought about a fist around 2 of my fingers at the exact moment my will was strong enough to stop. Half a second weaker and I'd have done it. And the worst part isn't that I nearly did it. The worst part is that I think it would have been justified by every measure anyone could name, and I still know it would have been the end of me. The line isn't where the justification runs out. The line is just the line, and I almost stepped over it for the best reason in the world, and the best reasons are exactly how it always starts." Luna was quiet a moment. Then she reached over and took one of his hands off the table and held it, and she did not say it was all right because she did not tell comfortable lies, and she did not say he had done well because nearly damning yourself is not a thing to be congratulated. "You didn't step over it," she said simply. "That's the only fact that signifies tonight. Not that you wanted to, not that you nearly did, not that it would have been justified. You didn't. You're keeping a promise to a sleeping child by main strength with the door open and the offer warm, and that is the hardest thing a person with your power can do, and you did it, and you'll do it again the next time and the time after, because that's what the warm room actually is, Harry. It isn't a feeling. It's a thing you choose over and over, while everything in you that's gone to ice tells you that this time the reasons are good enough. They're always going to be good enough. You just have to keep choosing the child over the reasons." She squeezed his hand. "Now drink your tea. Andromeda's coming down and she'll want to pretend she isn't shaken, and you're going to help her pretend, because that's also the warm room. It's mostly tea in the end. People think it's grand and it's mostly tea." Andromeda came down and pretended she was not shaken, and they helped her pretend, and Harry drank the tea and held the line one more night on purpose against the cold he was carrying everywhere else. Harry went to Hogwarts that night because there was a conversation 3 years overdue and the war had finally made it unavoidable. The castle knew him. That was the thing he had not been prepared for, crossing the grounds under the cloak of Ignatus in the dark. The way the old stone seemed to lean toward him the same degree the firelight did now, recognizing not the student who had walked its corridors but the inheritance he had grown into, because Hogwarts was older than the Ministry and remembered, in whatever way a castle remembers, what the heir of the brothers was. He let himself into the headmistress's office past wards that knew him, while Minerva McGonagall slept in a tower he did not disturb because his quarrel was not with her, and he stood in the round office among the portraits of the dead heads, and he woke the one he had come for. "Hello, Professor," Harry said. "We need to talk about what you did." Albus Dumbledore's portrait opened its painted eyes, and the painted face arranged itself into the expression Harry had spent his childhood trusting, the twinkling regret, the grandfatherly sorrow, the look of a man who carried great burdens and wished, how he wished, that he had not had to set any of them on the shoulders of the young. It was a very good portrait. It had all of Dumbledore's manner and a portion of his cunning, and it looked at the dead man in the dark office and did the thing the living Dumbledore had always done, which was to grieve beautifully in advance for the harm he was about to defend. "Harry," the portrait said softly, "so it is true I had hoped—" "Don't." Harry's voice was quiet. "I've heard you grieve before you wound. I grew up on it. I'm not here for the performance, Professor. I'm here for the document. There's a sealed instruction in the Department of Mysteries. It came into their possession after your death through a channel only you could have arranged, and it told them what I was and what to do if I ever became dangerous, and it gave them the binding procedure, the framework, the whole architecture of how to take a wizard apart who'd grown too powerful to check. Hermione thinks she invented that framework. She didn't. She refined yours. You left them the means to destroy me before I'd finished growing into the thing you raised me to be, and you left it sealed so that it would only open when they'd already decided to use it, so that your hand would never show." He stepped closer to the painted face. "I've read it. The goblins found it for me. It's in your hand, Professor, the real one, the cipher you used for the things you never meant to be read by the living. Tell me I'm wrong." Portrait's grief did not waver because a portrait cannot feel caught. It can only perform the scripted subject painted into it, and the script Dumbledore had left for this exact confrontation was a masterpiece of preemptive sorrow. "You are not wrong," the portrait said gently. "I did leave them the means. I want you to understand why, Harry, because I believe that even now, even as you are capable of understanding it. You were always going to be the most powerful wizard of your age. I knew it when you were 11. The prophecy, the connection to Tom, the things you survived that should have killed you, the way magic answered you when it should not have. I raised a weapon, yes, I needed one, the war required it. But I have lived long enough to know what becomes of weapons after their wars, that they do not lay themselves down, that a man who has been pointed at darkness his whole life will, when the darkness is gone, go looking for more, and that the most dangerous thing in any piece is the hero the war made and the piece is no use for. The painted eyes were kind and terrible. I left them the means to stop you because I loved you enough to foresee what you might become, and to give the world a way to survive it. I was right, Harry, look at yourself, look at what you are doing, I was right. Harry stood in the dark office and let the portrait's words settle because they had teeth, and a man who does not feel the teeth of a true thing is a man who has stopped being honest with himself. That's the trick of you, isn't it? He said at last. It always was. You tell a truth so that the lie rides in behind it. You're right that I'm dangerous. You're right that I've become something the piece has no use for. But you've arranged those true things into a shape that hides the only question that matters, which is why. Why did the weapon go looking for more darkness, Professor? Why does the hero the war made come back to tear down the piece? He did not raise his voice. Because the piece betrayed him. Because the world you taught me to die for took the first excuse to break me and bury me, and it did it using the framework you left them, the framework that existed because you decided when I was 11 that I would one day need destroying. You didn't foresee what I'd become, you caused it. You raised a child to give everything, and then you handed the world the tools to discard him when he had nothing left to give, and you sealed the tools so your hand wouldn't show, and now your portrait sits here and calls the wreckage a prophecy fulfilled. He leaned close to the painted face. You didn't predict the weapon would turn, you built the turning into the design. And the cruelest part, the part I came here to say to your face, painted or not, is that I think you knew. I think some part of you always knew that the way you used me would end exactly here, with me standing in this office having become the thing you feared, and I think you decided it was an acceptable price because you were always willing to pay with other people's lives for outcomes you decided were good. You called it the greater good once with another dark wizard when you were young. You never stopped believing in it. You only got better at hiding the ledger. The portrait was quiet. For a moment the painted face lost a little of its script, and something that might in a living man have been doubt moved across it, the residue of whatever genuine love the real Dumbledore had managed to feel underneath the strategy. What will you do, the portrait asked. Now that you have torn down the piece and exposed the men who broke you, you will rule, I can see it in you. And you will tell yourself it is to build something better, and perhaps for a time it will be. But power keeps, Harry. It keeps a long time, longer for you than for most, and there is no one left who can check you, and a man with unchecked power and a wound that will not close becomes, in the end. You, Harry said. Becomes you, yes. I've thought about it more than you ever did because unlike you I've been on the receiving end of a man who decided he knew the greater good, and I have no intention of becoming him, and I've built the checks you never let anyone build on you. There are 3 people alive who can tell me no, and no, I'll listen. You never let a single soul hold that power over you, not Grindelwald, not McGonagall, not me. That's the difference between us, Professor, and it's the whole difference. You love the greater good. I love 3 specific people in a country full of others the greater good would have spent without blinking. That's a smaller thing to love, and it's the thing that's going to keep me from becoming you. He stepped back. I'm going to expose the instruction. The whole country is going to learn that the great Albus Dumbledore raised the boy who lived as a weapon and prearranged his destruction. Your legend dies tonight the same way mine did in print with the truth. I find I can live with that. Goodbye, Professor. Sleep well if portraits sleep. You earn the rest. You just didn't earn the worship, and I'm taking that back. He left the portrait in the dark, the painted face for once without a script, and he walked out of the castle that leaned toward him. And behind him the most trusted name in magical Britain began quietly to come apart, the last of the betrayers exposed, the mentor's hand finally shown. The Dumbledore instruction ran in the prophet under Skeeter's byline 3 days after Harry left the dark office, and it did to the country what nothing else in the whole campaign had managed, because the country could lose its faith in a minister or a newspaper or a provision and survive it. But the country had built a great deal of itself on Albus Dumbledore and the discovery that the kindest, wisest name in its history had raised a child as a weapon and sealed the means of his destruction before the child could shave was a wound to the national idea of itself that no government could absorb. Skeeter ran it straight, as Harry had taught her, without a single reaching adjective, the cipher decoded and reproduced in Dumbledore's own hand beside a plain account of where it had been found and what it instructed, and the plainness was unanswerable. The ministry tried in the first hours to call it a forgery, and the Goblin nation, which does not lie about documents because lying about documents is the one thing a goblin holds beneath contempt, issued a statement of 3 sentences attesting that the instruction was genuine, recovered from the Department of Mystery's own deep holdings, and unaltered, and the Goblin's word on a document was the one authority in Britain that stood above the ministry, and everyone knew it. And the forgery story died in an afternoon. After that the collapse stopped being gradual. The Wisengamot that had certified the binding as mercy now sat in sessions that could not reach a quorum, members declining to be seen voting with a government the country had turned against. The Office of Public Confidence was disbanded, too late, its disbanding only confirming that it had existed to do the thing the exposés said it did. Enforcement units stopped being sent because no commander would carry a wagon into a province that might stand in the road. And because the units themselves had begun quietly to refuse, 6 men on a Devon lane having told the story to 12 and 12 to 50 of a power that sent them home alive and asked them why their own government kept sending them to die. The provision was not repealed because there was no longer a functioning body to repeal it. It simply stopped being enforced, a law still written and no longer obeyed, which is the condition of a government in the last weeks before it discovers it has already ended. Harry watched the collapse through Draco's reports and did not move to hasten it, because a thing that is falling does not need to be pushed, it needs only to be allowed to finish, and because the discipline that had kept him from 6 bodies on a lane was the same discipline that kept him from seizing the empty building a week too early. He waited. He had learned to wait in a house above the sea against the patient example of the rock and the water, and he waited now for the one event the collapse still required, which was not the Ministry's fall that was certain, but the Ministry's last violent reach, the cornered, careful man's final decision to answer an argument he had lost with a force he still possessed. He needed Kingsley to reach for the weapon in front of the whole country. Until then he held and built and visited a moor in Devon and let the warm room stay lit one night at a time, and prepared the ground for the morning the ships would come. Hermione found him in the end, which he had known she would, because she was the only one of them clever enough to work out where a dead man would have to stand. She came to the house above the sea. He did not know how she found it until he saw the calculation behind it that she had not found the house. She had found the one place on the coast where the wards bent the world enough to be noticed by someone who knew exactly what to look for, and she had stood at the edge of it and called his name into the wind, alone, unarmed, which was either the bravest or the most calculated thing she had done in 3 years. And with Hermione it had always been impossible to tell. Because she had never learned that the two were different, he let her in. He brought her to the long hall where he had planned the demolition of everything she had built, and he gave her tea she did not drink, and they sat across a table the way they had sat across 100 tables, and for a moment the years folded, and she was the girl who had pulled him through every impossible thing by refusing to let the world be as bad as it was. "You're alive," Hermione said. "All this time, the gray man." "Yaxley the prophet, Ron, all of it, you." Her hands were flat on the table and they were not steady. "Do you know what I've been doing for 3 years, Harry? I've been telling myself that the danger in you killed you, that my framework was mercy, that you forced their hand by refusing it, that the binding failed because of the instability everyone warned about, that I tried to save you and the thing you'd become made it impossible. I built a whole life on that story. I needed it to be true. You spent those same 3 years proving every word of it was a lie I told myself so I could sleep." "Yes," Harry said, "just yes." Her voice cracked. "No defense. No, Harry, I wrote that framework to keep them from putting you in Azkaban. I counted the votes. There was no version where you walked free. I checked everything. I always check everything, and the binding was the only door that didn't end with you dead or in a cell, and you counted the votes," Harry said. "I remember. You said it in the office the day you brought me the parchment. I've thought about it for 3 years, that sentence, because it's the most honest thing you ever said to me, and you didn't know it. You counted the votes. You treated my life as a sum to be solved within the constraints the room gave you, and you solved it brilliantly, and you never once stood up in that room and said the constraints are monstrous and I will not work within them. That's what the old you would have done. The girl who freed house elves and blackmailed a journalist and punched Draco Malfoy in the face for being cruel. She didn't count votes, she set the terms on fire. And somewhere in the years between her and the woman who brought me a containment framework and called it a door, you decided that being effective inside a broken system was the same as being good. And it isn't Hermione, it never was, it's just the most comfortable place for a clever person to hide." She was crying now the way clever people cry, fighting it, furious at it. "So I'm the villain after everything. I'm the one who Ron lied about the rune and let them bury you, and you forgave him enough not to kill him, and I tried to save your life with the only tool I had, and I'm the one I didn't forgive Ron," Harry said. "I told him to his face I couldn't, and you're not the villain, Hermione. That's the thing I need you to understand, because it's worse than being the villain. Ron betrayed me out of fear and weakness and got swept along by it, and that's a human, ordinary, forgivable thing, even if I've lost the part that does the forgiving. You betrayed me out of conviction. You looked at a wrong and you understood it completely better than anyone. You've always understood everything better than anyone, and then you used that understanding to build the wrong a more efficient machine. You didn't get swept along, you engineered. The framework that bound me is being used on children now, Hermione, 19-year-olds, your framework. Certified, permanent, irreversible, the best work you ever did, and it's the cruelest thing anyone in this whole affair has built, and you built it convinced you were the only one in the room who truly cared. That's not villainy. That's something I don't have a clean word for. It's what happens when the smartest, most caring person you know decides that their care entitles them to redesign other people for their own good." Hermione put her face in her hands, and for a long moment the only sound in the long hall was the sea doing its old patient work on the rock below, and Harry watched the woman who had been his best friend come apart against the truth, and he did not reach across the table because the part of him that would have was gone, and he had stopped pretending otherwise. When she could speak again, she asked the only question that mattered, which was the same question the portrait had asked, and he gave her a different answer because she was alive, and the living can still change the shape of what they've done. "What are you going to do?" Hermione said. "To all of us, to the Ministry, to me." "I'm going to win," Harry said. Kingsley is about to throw everything he has at me, and he's going to lose in public, and the country is going to watch its government try to murder the power that's been protecting it. And when the dust settles, I'm going to be holding the building because there won't be anyone left standing who can hold it instead. And then I'm going to remake it. The provision, the binding, the office of public confidence, the Wisengamot that tries children for the crime of being powerful, all of it. Taken apart and built again so it can't do to the next person what it did to me, and to Ira Price, and to a 19-year-old whose name I never learned, whose wrists your cords went around. He looked at her. And you're going to help me, not because I've forgiven you. Because you're the best legal mind in 3 generations, and the thing I'm building needs to be built right, with checks I can't remove and a law that binds the ruler harder than the ruled, and there's no one alive who can build that better than the woman who built the cage. You made the most efficient instrument of containment in the history of magical Britain. I want you to spend the rest of your life making the most efficient instrument for restraining people like me, including me, especially me. That's your sentence, Hermione, not Azkaban, not exile, a desk and the hardest problem in the world, and 40 years to get it right in the service of the man you helped destroy, building the chains that go on his own throne. Hermione stared at him. You let me build chains for you, she said, knowing what I am, knowing I'll mean them. Knowing you'll mean them is the entire point, Harry said. I told you I've spent 3 years building the know into the structure, Luna who sees when I've gone too cold. Andromeda who buried better people than me, Neville who'll tell me to my face. And you who'll build the law that stops me when the 3 of them aren't enough. 4 checks, Hermione, and you're the coldest and the cleverest of them, and that makes you the most important. The girl who set the terms on fire is still in there. I need her. The country needs her. I'm offering you the chance to be her again in the service of undoing the thing the vote counter built. He stood. You don't have to answer now. But think about it, knowing that it's the only version of the rest of your life, where the framework you wrote stops being the worst thing you ever did and becomes the foundation of the best. She left without answering, back across the bending edge of the wards into the wind, and Harry watched her go, and he did not know yet which woman would come back, the vote counter or the one who set the terms on fire, and he found that the not knowing was the first uncertain thing he had allowed himself in 3 years, and that it felt distantly like the warm room widening by an inch. Ginny came the day after Hermione, and she came because Luna brought her, which was the only way she could have come, because Ginny would never have presumed to look for him, and Luna would never have brought someone he was not ready to see. She's been asking me for a year whether you were alive, Luna said at the edge of the wards, with Ginny standing a few paces back in the wind off the sea, smaller than Harry remembered her, the harpy's confidence gone out of her shoulders. I told her I couldn't say. She didn't believe me because no one believes me, which is usually convenient. She needs to say a thing to you and you need to hear it, and then I'm taking her home, and what you do with it is yours. Luna looked between them with her pale, unbothered eyes. I'll be on the cliff. Don't be cruel, Harry. You don't have the forgiving anymore, I know, but you've still got the not being cruel, and they're not the same thing, and you'll want to have kept the second one. She walked off toward the cliff, and Harry and Ginny stood in the wind, and for a while neither of them used the words they had been carrying for 3 years. I didn't know you were alive, Ginny said at last. I want to say that first so you don't think I stayed away knowing. When you died, She stopped and started again, more honestly. When they told us you died in the binding, a part of me was relieved, and I've hated myself for that relief every day since, because the relief wasn't that you were gone, it was that I'd never have to stand in front of you and account for the kitchen. And now here you are, and I have to account for it anyway, and I find I'm glad, even though it's the worst thing I've ever had to do, because 3 years of being relieved I'd escaped it was so much worse than just doing it. The kitchen, Harry said. I looked at the floor. Her voice did not break, which he understood cost her everything. I had the words. I'd heard Ron in the burrow, before the prophet got to him, saying it was the rune, that he hadn't set the south rune. I heard him say it to Mum with my own ears, and then the story changed and everyone let it change, and I knew Harry. I knew the truth, and I had the standing to say it, and I stood in your kitchen while they led you out, and I looked at the floor, because saying it meant losing the family, the name, the easy life that had survived the war when nothing else did, and I chose the floor. I chose it. Not out of conviction like Hermione, not out of fear like Ron. I just wanted to keep my life. I wanted to keep being Ginny Weasley, who played for the Harpies and was loved, and the price of keeping her was your life, and I paid it. And I told myself it was too late to do anything anyway, which was a lie, because in the courtroom I found out it wasn't too late. I stood up in front of all of them and refused them, and it felt like courage, and it wasn't, it was just safe, because by then it cost me nothing but the ministry's disapproval. I was brave in the one room where bravery was free, and a coward in the one where it would have mattered. Harry was quiet, the sea working the rock below them. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, Ginny said. Luna told me you can't, and I believe her, and I wouldn't want it anyway, because forgiveness would mean it wasn't as bad as it was, and it was exactly as bad as it was. I'm here because you let everyone in that kitchen choose what they were in front of you on purpose. I worked that out later, and I chose the floor, and you've carried the knowledge of it for 3 years, and the least I owe you is to come and choose differently to your face. So here it is. I should have spoken. I knew the truth, and I had the standing, and I chose my comfortable life over yours, and there is no version of that I get to be proud of, and I've stopped trying to find one. That's all. That's what I came to say. The rest is yours. Harry looked at her a long moment, the woman he had once planned an ordinary life with, who had looked at a floor on the worst night of his, and he searched himself for the thing Luna had warned him to keep, the not being cruel that was not the same as the forgiving he had lost, and he found it narrow but real in the warm room he kept lit on purpose. In the courtroom, he said, you were the only person all day who refused them. It came too late and it cost you nothing, and you know both of those things better than I could tell you. But you stood up, Ginny, when Ron sat and lied and Hermione watched and Kingsley counted, and you stood up and told the Wisengamot to find someone else to hold the knife. I've carried the floor for 3 years. I've also carried that. They're both true, and I'm not going to let the floor erase the standing up, the way I won't let the standing up erase the floor. You were a coward when it was expensive and brave when it was free, and that makes you neither a villain nor a hero. It makes you a person, an ordinary, frightened person who failed someone they loved and then half-redeemed it in a room where it didn't count. He let that sit. I can't forgive you. But I can tell you the truth, which is more than most people in your life are going to give you. And the truth is that you're not the worst of them, and you're not the best, and you came here to account for it without being asked, and that's worth something, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't to make either of us feel the loss more sharply. Go home, Ginny, live your life. It's the sentence I'd have wanted once. Just don't ever again be brave only where it's free. That's the whole of what I have to teach you, and you can have it for nothing. Kingsley came for him 3 days later with everything exactly as Draco had said he would. The careful man had stopped being careful. He had watched his coalition collapse, his tame newspaper turn, his enforcers sent home disarmed, his soft leverage against a child blow up in his hand, and the great name of Dumbledore come apart in print, taking the ministry's last borrowed authority with it. And he had arrived, as cornered, careful men do, at the conviction that the only move left was the largest one. He could not find the house above the sea. But he had learned from Hermione's return that there was a stretch of coast where the world bent, and he did not need to find the house to bring a war to the coast. And so he brought one, the full force of the Ministry of Magic, Aurors and Unspeakables, and the Wisengamot's last loyal hit wizards, and a thing the Department of Mysteries had been building since the penance, a great binding engine mounted on the deck of a commandeered ship, the apparatus from the round room rebuilt and enlarged and aimed. This time, not at one man on an altar, but at a whole stretch of coast, an instrument designed to sever every wizard within its reach from the source they drew from, the binding made into a weapon of war. They came at dawn up the gray water, under a sky the color of old iron, and Harry stood on the black cliffs above the house that had no name and watched the Ministry of Magic sail its whole remaining strength toward him. And he understood that this was the moment the entire campaign had been built to produce. The frightened government reaching for force first in the open where the country could see, and he understood also that the country was seeing. Because Skeeter was on the headland a mile south with 3 other journalists and a charmed quill, exactly where Draco's network had arranged for her to be, and whatever happened on this water would happen in tomorrow's papers in front of everyone and could never be edited into a story about a monster, because the monster was standing alone on a cliff and the ministry had brought a weapon designed to unmake an entire coastline to kill him. He let them get close. He let the binding engine on the ship's deck wind up to full power, the dense old runes crawling and flaring toward the color the eye refused, the cold water smell rolling off the water and up the cliffs because he wanted the country to see the size of what they had built to use on him, and he wanted the men on the ships to have every chance to understand what they were about to do and to choose even now not to do it. He gave them the chance. No one took it. The engine reached full power and aimed itself at the coast, and at the man on the cliff who was the heir of the 3 brothers, and the senior unspeakable who had once asked him, "What are you?" raised her wand to give the order to fire the binding into a whole stretch of the world. And Harry reached down past the warm root into the deep dark where the attention lay, and he did the thing he had spent 3 years learning he could do and praying he would never have to, and he woke it all the way up. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Sovereign, the deep dark came awake all the way, and the morning broke open around Harry Potter like a held breath finally let go. He had touched the inheritance 100 ways in 3 years, brushed it, drawn on it, let it rise to the surface of him in a Goblin hall in a penance street. He had never opened it fully because there had never been a reason large enough, and because some part of him had been afraid of what waking it would make of him. The binding engine on the deck of the lead ship gave him the reason. He set the fear aside on the black cliff with the country watching from a headland a mile south, and he reached all the way down to the floor he had not known had a floor, and he woke the oldest fact in the world and let it look through his eyes at the people who had built a weapon to unmake a coastline. What it was to wake it fully, he could never afterward render in words the living would understand, and he stopped trying because the words came out sounding like Cadmus, and Cadmus had gone mad on exactly this. It was not power in the sense the dueling hall had taught him power, the directed force of a will against a target. It was scale. The thing in the deep dark did not lend him strength. It widened him until the cliff and the sea and the iron sky and the 3 ships and the 300 frightened men aboard them were not separate things he was acting upon but regions of a single field he was suddenly, hugely present throughout. And he felt the binding engine winding toward discharge the way a man feels a muscle in his own arm, and he felt the fear of the men on the ships as he felt his own pulse. And under all of it, he felt the oldest fact in the world regard the morning through him with an attention that had been old when the rock was young, that had watched every empire the species had ever raised decide it was permanent, that was not impressed, that had never once been impressed, and that found the ministry's great weapon aimed at a coast to make a man safe to murder, precisely as significant as a child's sandcastle raised against the very tide now holding still at his feet. And in the widening, he felt the temptation, the true one, the only one that had ever frightened him about himself, and it was not the temptation to destroy the fleet that was small, a thing a frightened man would want. The real temptation was the scale itself. He was, in that moment, large enough to simply continue to keep widening, to let the field that had taken in a coastline take in the county and the country and the living world, to become a thing that did not rule the world so much as constitute it, present in every death and every ending everywhere, the master of the oldest fact made permanent and total, and it would not even have felt like ambition. It would have felt like growth. It would have felt like finally becoming the size the inheritance had always implied, and the men on the tiers and the man in the warm office and the painted face in the dark would all, at last, have been correct, 3 years too early and for the wrong reasons, about exactly what he was. He felt how easy it would be. That was the thing the witnesses never knew, watching from the headland, that the most powerful wizard in the history of the country stood on a cliff for the space of 3 heartbeats deciding whether to remain a person, and that the decision was genuinely in doubt, and that nothing in the structure of magic or the law of the land or the strength of any enemy could have tipped it either way, because there was no force left that operated at his scale. The only thing that operated at his scale was a choice, and the choice had no leverage behind it but a table in Devon and a fist around 2 fingers and a terrible cake and a woman who would tell him no, and against the pull of becoming the size of the world those things should have weighed nothing at all. They weighed everything. That was the whole of it, the entire secret of the difference between Harry Potter and every other being who had ever been handed this much. That he had spent 3 years deliberately loving things too small to matter at the scale he could reach on purpose as a discipline, as the one anchor that could hold a person inside a power that wanted to dissolve him into a fact. And when the widening offered to take him past the last edge of himself, he reached, not down into the deep dark, but sideways. Toward a moor and a child and a step where someone was waiting, and he held to those instead, and he stopped growing, and he stayed by the hardest act of his life exactly the size of a man. Then, being still a man and a furious one and one with a navy in the sky and 3 years of patience spent, he did the thing a man does instead of the thing a god would have done. He gave the engine back its own discharge, and he held the ships, and he set them down unharmed, and he kept at the very summit of the only ascension the country would ever record, the small and load-bearing fact that he had refused the actual ascension, the real one, the one no one watching had even known was on offer, and that the refusal and not the navy was the true climax of the morning, witnessed by no one, understood by no one, and decisive forever. The sky did not darken, which the witnesses expected and later could not explain. It did the opposite. The iron-gray overcast thinned and went clear and then went past clear into a high cold light that had no source, the light of a morning that belonged to no particular sun, and the air took on the scorched clean smell of the instant after lightning, and the gray sea below the cliffs went glass still, every wave that had been climbing simply ceasing to climb, the whole restless ocean holding its position as though the thing that gave the sea permission to move had turned its attention elsewhere. On the ships, men who had sailed up the coast to commit an atrocity in the name of safety felt the temperature of the world drop and looked up at a sky that should not exist and understood in the marrow that they had made a mistake whose size they did not have the vocabulary for. The binding engine fired anyway. The senior unspeakable gave the order because she was brave and because she had built her life on the principle that there was no magic that could not be catalogued and countered. And the great rebuilt apparatus discharged its severing into the coast and the cliff and the figure standing on it. A wave of unmaking designed to cut every wizard within its reach from the source they drew from, the binding made vast, the same thing they had done to him in a round room scaled up to swallow a county. It reached Harry and it reached the thing looking through him, and it did against that what a thrown stone does against the tide. The severing arrived and found, where a wizard's root should have been, the deep dark that owns all severing, the master of the thing that cuts all things from all things, and it could no more sever him from his source than a knife can cut the idea of cutting, and the wave of unmaking broke against the cliff and did not unmake him. And then, because force that meets a true immovable thing has to go somewhere, it turned. He did not turn it on the men. That was the thing the country saw, the thing Skeeter's charmed quill recorded and 4 journalists swore to, and the whole of magical Britain read the next morning and could never afterward unknow. He could have turned the severing back on the fleet and cut 300 ministry wizards from their magic in an instant, left them squibs bobbing on a glass sea, and no one watching would have called it anything but justice. He did not. He took the broken wave of unmaking, the vast severing the ministry had aimed at a coastline, and he folded it with the grammar and the inheritance together back into the engine that had cast it, and the great rebuilt apparatus on the deck of the lead ship received its own discharge entire, and the dense old runes that men had operated without understanding completed all at once, a sentence those men had never meant to finish, and the binding engine unmade itself. The way its smaller ancestor had unmade itself in a round room 3 years before, leaning inward, flaring past the color the eye refused, and then ceasing to be an engine, ceasing to be anything, a weapon that had reached for the master of endings and found its own. The ship under it did not sink, he held it. He held all of them, the whole fleet, lifting the ships off the glass sea and holding them suspended in the impossible high light. 300 ministry wizards weightless and disarmed and entirely at the mercy of the thing on the cliff. exactly as he had held 2 officers in a market square and 24 in a Penance street and 6 on a Devon lane, the same mercy scaled to the size of a navy. He held them there long enough for every soul aboard and every soul on the headland, and through Skeeter's quill every soul in the country, to understand the shape of the choice being made in front of them, which was that the most powerful wizard in the history of magical Britain had a fleet that had come to murder him hanging helpless in the air, and was not going to kill a single one of them. Then he set them down gently on the glass-still water and gave the sea back its permission to move, and the high cold light faded into an ordinary iron morning, and the binding engine was gone, and 300 wizards sat in their ships on a heaving gray sea and discovered they were alive, and that the dead man on the cliff had let them stay that way, and that there was no longer, anywhere in the country, a single person who believed the thing the ministry had spent 6 years saying he was. The government did not fall that morning so much as it finished a falling that had been underway for a year, the way a building does not collapse when you remove the last beam but only completes a collapse the earlier beams had already decided. By the time the fleet limped back into the estuary, the news had outrun it. Skeeter's account ran in an emergency edition before noon, 4 bylines, charmed images of a navy held weightless above a glass sea by a man who let it go, and the country read it and made in the space of a single afternoon the decision Harry had spent 3 years arranging it to be free to make. It did not rise up. There was no mob, no storming of the atrium, because Harry had built the whole campaign precisely to avoid the moment where a crowd does his work and a tyrant inherits the crowd. The country simply, quietly, all at once, stopped believing the ministry had the right to govern it, and a government that has lost the belief of the governed is not overthrown. It is merely one morning no longer obeyed. The Wisengamot could not convene. The Auror office would not take orders to move against the Grey Man who had let 24 of their own go home alive and was now in every account the only power that had protected the people the government preyed on. The provinces that had stood in the road against the wagons now simply ignored the ministry's writs entirely, and there was no force left willing to make them stop, because the force had been on the ships, and the ships had come home with their crews alive by the mercy of the one the writs were meant to bind. Kingsley Shacklebolt sat in the warm office with the 2 steady fire and watched his government become a set of empty rooms, and understood that he had reached for the largest force in the country and discovered that force was the one thing that no longer worked, that he had spent the last of his authority on an atrocity that did not even occur, and that the only question remaining to him was how he would meet the one who had let him lose. Harry came to him at the end, because there was a conversation that had been waiting since a warm office and a glass of something Kingsley had not offered to share, and because the institution deserved to be answered by a person and not a legend. He came without the fleet-breaking light, without the grammar that arrived in the bone as himself, walking into the minister's office through doors that opened because there was no longer anyone willing to keep them shut, and he found Kingsley Shacklebolt sitting behind the desk he had sacrificed a friend to keep, an old man now, the size gone out of him, the careful watchfulness collapsed into something quieter. "I've been trying to decide," Kingsley said, "whether you've come to kill me. I find I can't tell anymore, which is its own kind of answer about what I've become." "I don't kill people who have already lost," Harry said. He did not sit. "I came to tell you what's going to happen, the way I came to tell Ron and Hermione, and the way I'd have come to tell you 3 years ago if you'd been the kind of man who let people into the room before he'd already done the arithmetic on them. You're going to resign, today. Not because I'm making you, though I am, but because there's nothing left to resign from, and a minister who clings to an empty office is a sad thing, and whatever else you were, Kingsley, you were never sad. You took the first watch so the rest of us could sleep. I haven't forgotten it. It's the only reason this conversation is happening in your office instead of on a ship." Kingsley was quiet a moment. "You know, I'll tell you it was the right call," he said, "sacrificing you. I've had 3 years to decide whether I'd take it back, and the terrible thing, Harry, the thing I have to live with, is that on the arithmetic I wouldn't 9 votes, a government that didn't fall to Yaxley's cousin. I weighed one man against the country, and I chose the country, and I'd choose it again, and I was wrong, and both of those are true, and I don't know how to hold them." He looked up. "Tell me how you hold them, you of all people. You've spent 3 years holding worse." "You hold them by stopping," Harry said. "That's the whole secret, and it's why I'm the one standing here and you're the one sitting there. You did the arithmetic that weighed a person against an outcome, and you got an answer, and you acted on it, and you never once stopped to ask whether being the kind of man who does that arithmetic was a thing you wanted to be." "I asked. In a round room on an altar while they tried to unmake me, I asked, and the answer was no, and everything I've built since is the answer to that no. You can hold a person against the country and choose the country, Kingsley. You just have to know that the moment you do it, you become a man who spends people, and you have to decide if you can live as that man, and you couldn't, which is why you've aged 10 years and 3. The arithmetic was always available to me. The whole of my power every day has been the refusal to run it. That's the difference between the thing I built and the thing you defended. Yours weighs people, mine won't. The country that stopped obeying its government did not, at first, know what to do instead, and a frightened, rudderless populace is the most dangerous thing in any transition, because it will reach for the first hand that promises to make the fear stop, and Harry had spent 3 years making certain the hand it reached for would not have to be a fist. He sent for Neville on the morning after the fleet came home. "It's time," Harry said, in the greenhouses where they had met in the dark a year and more before. "The thing I told you I'd need. The country's frightened, Neville. It's just watched a dead man hold a navy in the air, and it doesn't know whether it's been saved or conquered, and it can't tell the difference from where it's standing. And a country that can't tell the difference will invent a tyrant to be afraid of just to have something solid to point at. It needs someone it trusts completely to stand up and tell it which one I am. I have power now. I have everything. The one thing I can't do is vouch for myself, because the powerful never can. It only ever sounds like a threat. That's your part. That's the part I've been keeping for you since the night you cried in this greenhouse and made me promise to listen when you tell me I've gone wrong. Neville looked at him a long moment among the breathing leaves, older, steadier, the decency in him grown into something with weight. And have you, he said, gone wrong anywhere? Before I stand up in front of the whole country and put my name on you, I need to hear you say it true, Harry. Have you done a thing in this campaign that I'd be lying to vouch against? I nearly killed 6 men on a Devon lane, Harry said without hesitation, because the price of Neville's trust was the truth and he paid it. They came for Teddy and I had the power up and the decision made and I was half a second from doing it. I didn't. But I wanted to, and I'd have been able to live with it, and that's the thing you should weigh before you put your name on me. I'm not clean, Neville. I'm a man who keeps choosing to stop every day by force and who knows exactly how close the not stopping always is. If you can vouch for that, vouch for it. If you can only vouch for a man who never wanted to cross the line, then don't, because that man isn't me and never was. Neville was quiet. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has heard the worst and found he can stand on it. That, he said, is the only answer that would have let me do it. A man who tells me he never wanted to is a man I can't trust. A man who tells me he wanted to and didn't and shows me the lane he didn't cross, that's a man I can stand next to. All right, I'll vouch. But I'm holding you to the rest of it, every day, the pulling and the growing, the way I said I would. And the day you stop being able to give me that answer is the day I stop. He stood up in front of the country 3 days later, Neville Longbottom, herbology master, the most trusted and least ambitious man in magical Britain, and he did not give a grand speech because grand speeches were the instrument of the men Harry had torn down. He told the truth plainly, the way Skeeter had learned to. He told them he had known Harry Potter since they were 11 and frightened in a castle, that he had watched the ministry lie about him and had said so at the time and been called disloyal for it, that he had spent the last year knowing Harry was alive and watching with his own eyes what kind of power Harry had become and what he had chosen to do with it. He told them about the wagons that had been refused and the children who had not been bound and the navy that had been set down gently on the sea. And then he told them the thing that mattered most, which was not that Harry was good because Neville was too honest to claim it, but that Harry had built with his own hands before he took an ounce of power the means by which the country could stop him if he ever became the thing they feared, and that a man who builds his own chains before he builds his throne is the only kind of ruler worth trusting, because he is the only kind who has admitted out loud that he might need stopping. The country listened to Neville Longbottom because it had no reason in the world to distrust him and a year of reasons to distrust everyone else. And when he finished, the fear did not vanish. Fear never vanishes on a word, but it changed its shape, from the blind terror that invents tyrants into the wary, watchful, survivable unease of a people willing to give a thing a chance and keep their eyes open, which was all Harry had ever needed from them and all he had built the proof to buy. He did not put Kingsley in a cell. He sent him home to a quiet life in the company of his own conscience, which Harry judged a heavier sentence than Azkaban for a man whose entire tragedy was that he had known better and chosen the chair. And the country which had wanted blood learned from the lack of it the first lesson of the order Harry meant to build, which was that the new power did not feed on punishment the way the old one had fed on fear. Then he took the building, and he did it as he had taken everything in 3 years, without ceremony and without a crowd and without a single drop of the spectacle that the man he had killed at 17 would have demanded. There was no coronation. There was no march on the atrium. There was a notice, published in the Prophet under Skeeter's byline and reprinted in every channel the network reached, announcing that an interim authority had assumed responsibility for the governance of magical Britain pending the construction of something better, that the dangerous magical persons provision was repealed in full and the binding procedure outlawed in perpetuity, that every vault the provision had seized would be returned with interest paid by the Goblin nation's calculation, that the Office of Public Confidence and the apparatus of bought opinion were dissolved, and that the persons responsible for the worst of it would be named, tried in open court, and judged in daylight by people who had not been paid in advance to find them guilty. It was signed with a name the country had buried 3 years before, and the country read the name and did not riot, and did not rejoice exactly, but did the more important thing, which was to exhale the way the courtroom had exhaled when they sentenced him, except that this time the breath the country let out was the fear it had been carrying since the war, the long terror of a society that had never in living memory been governed by anyone who was not either afraid of it or hungry for it, and was now, for the first time, going to find out what it was like to be governed by someone who was simply, coldly, unhungrily determined that it never again break the people who carried it. He built the new thing slowly over the months that followed with the patience the rock had taught him. He did not rule alone, though the power to was his, because a man who rules alone is a man building toward the cliff he watched Dumbledore and Tom both go over. He built the checks first before the throne, which no ruler in the country's history had ever done. He gave Hermione Granger the desk in the hardest problem in the world, and she took it, the woman who set the terms on fire returning to the surface of the woman who counted votes, and she spent the rest of her life building the law that bound the ruler harder than the ruled, a constitution for a country that had never had one, with Harry's own power written into it as the first thing the law existed to restrain. He installed Neville Longbottom where the country could see him. The decent man's vote of confidence made flesh the proof, with the standing right and the duty to tell the sovereign to his face when he had begun to pull things that should have been let to grow. He kept Luna near and Andromeda's table and the promise to a child and the Goblin nation as a sovereign equal rather than a vault to be raided, and the discarded raised up into the running of the thing that had once thrown them away. The first thing the discarded learned about the new order was that it came looking for them, not with a wagon but with a restitution. Ira Price, the girl from the Welsh borders whose accidental magic had never stopped at the age it was supposed to stop, received a letter under the new authority's seal, and the letter did not summon her for assessment, it offered her a place. Her gift, the thing the provision had called a danger to be bound, was a rare and valuable sensitivity to unstable magic, and the new order had decided that a country which had spent 6 years binding such gifts out of its children might do better to teach them instead. And so the girl who had been a hole in the structure was offered, at 19, a training and a future and a hand from the very state that had sent men to take hers. The metalworker whose forge frightened his neighbors was commissioned to make wards for the rebuilt courts. The old woman in the fishing village whose grief had curdled into storms was sent a healer who specialized in exactly that, the first such healer the country had trained, because the new order had decided that a magic that goes wrong from sorrow is a thing to be tended and not a thing to be cut. One by one, in the months that followed, the people the old machine had thrown away found themselves not merely safe but wanted, and the wanting did more to secure the new order than any law could have, because the people who have been thrown away and then gathered back up do not easily let anyone throw their neighbors away again. Harry built the law itself in the open, which no government in the country's history had done, every draft published, every clause argued in daylight, because the old order had governed by sealing its instructions, and he meant the new one to govern by being unable to seal anything. Hermione Granger's constitution took 3 years to write and bound the sovereign in ways the sovereign had insisted on and the lawyers had thought insane. It gave the people the right to know every order the authority gave. It gave Neville Longbottom, and whoever held his office after him, the standing to refuse an unjust command and the protection to survive the refusal. It wrote the Goblin nation in as a sovereign equal, the first treaty in 3 centuries that did not pretend the charters were a courtesy. And in its first article, before anything else, before the powers of the state were named, it named the limit on them, the line the new order would not cross no matter the justification, the same line a man had not crossed on a Devon lane made into law, that no person would ever again be unmade for the crime of being powerful, that the gift was not the danger, that the danger was only ever what a frightened structure chose to do with its fear. He did not call himself a king. The histories would call him one, and the channels and the schools, but the title he took was older and plainer and truer, the title the goblins had recognized before any of it began. And he governed under it the way the rock governed the sea, by being immovable and patient and in no hurry at all, present in every corner of the country through a state rebuilt from the people it had once discarded, and absent from the spectacle the way Tom Riddle had never been able to be absent. Because Harry did not need to be watched being powerful, he needed only for the wagons never to run again, and they never did. Hermione took the desk. She came back across the bending edge of the wards a month after the fleet, and she did not announce which woman she had decided to be. She simply arrived with a case of parchment and a list of every flaw in the interim authority's legal footing, and Harry understood, reading the list, that the vote counter and the woman who set the terms on fire had stopped being 2 people and become one, that the formidable mind which had once built the most efficient cage in the country's history had turned itself entirely to the problem of building the thing that could never be a cage again. Your authority is illegitimate, she told him on the first day with the case open between them and no tea offered or wanted. You know that. You hold the country because you're the only power left standing and the people are too frightened to refuse you, and that's exactly the footing every tyrant in history has stood on, and it will rot, Harry, it always rots. The day the fear fades and the legitimacy was never built. We build the legitimacy properly from the ground, and the first thing we build before the powers, before the institutions, before any of it, is the mechanism by which the country removes you, because a power that cannot be removed is a power that has already decided it is permanent, and permanent power is the only kind I will not help you keep. You'd write the law for your own removal into the founding document, Harry said. Mine, knowing I could ignore it, knowing there's no force that compels me. That's the point. She did not look up from the parchment. There's no force that compels you, there never will be. So the only thing that can bind you is a thing you bind yourself with in public, before witnesses, in a document you cannot later claim you never agreed to. And the whole of my job for the rest of my life is to make that binding so clear and so witnessed and so woven into how the country sees itself that the day you decide to break it, breaking it costs you the one thing you actually care about, which is being able to tell yourself you didn't become him. She looked up then, and her eyes were the eyes of the girl who had freed house elves, sharpened by everything that had happened to both of them. I built you a cage once and called it mercy, You were right about that. It was the worst thing I ever did, and I've stopped pretending otherwise. So I'm going to spend 40 years building the opposite, not a cage for the powerless. A leash for the powerful held by the powerless, written so well that even you can't untie it without everyone seeing your hands move. That's my penance and my work, and the only apology I have that's worth anything, because words were never my apology to give. Law is, let me give it. Harry looked at the woman who had broken him with her conviction, now turning the same conviction into the only thing that could keep him from breaking the country, and he found in the warm room he kept lit on purpose something that was not forgiveness because the forgiving was still gone but was its working substitute, a cold, clear respect for a mind that had finally pointed itself at the right target. I'm not going to forgive you, he said. You know that. I distrust the law if you did, Hermione said. Forgiveness would mean you stopped watching me, and I need you watching me as much as the country needs me watching you. That's the design, Harry. 4 people who'll tell you no, and one of them is the woman who already proved she'd choose a principal over you because that's exactly the person you want holding your leash. Not someone who loves you too much to pull it, someone who's done it before. She bent back to the parchment. Now sit down and read Clause 1, and tell me where I've left you a way out, because I've left you exactly one, on purpose. And I want to see how long it takes the most dangerous wizard in Britain to find the door I built for him to be tempted by and not take. He sat down and he read Clause 1, and it took him a long time to find the door because she was very good. And when he found it, he left it shut, and she watched him leave it shut, and neither of them said anything about it, because the not saying was the whole of the trust they were ever going to have, and it was, between the two of them, enough. The judgments came in open court, in daylight, in a courtroom 10 with the chains taken out of the floor, because Harry had ordered them removed on the first day, and the order had been in its quiet way the whole of his philosophy of rule. Hesper Yaxley and the architects of the Seizure Trust went to Azkaban because they had stolen, and theft was theft, and the new order did not pretend otherwise. The senior unspeakable who had fired a weapon at a coastline was not imprisoned, because she had acted under orders and within a structure that had told her she was keeping the world safe, and Harry, who understood better than anyone alive what a structure can persuade a decent person to do, gave her instead the task of dismantling, piece by piece, every instrument of binding the Department of Mysteries held, a penance shaped like the crime. Rita Skeeter kept her byline and her freedom and her noose, bound by the contract in the old grammar to a lifetime of printing only what she could prove, which for a woman of her gifts was either a punishment or a redemption, and would, Harry suspected, turn out over the years to be both. Ron Weasley he did not summon because he had said all of it already under a commissioned portrait, and the truth had done its work, and Ron lived now in the long quiet sentence Harry had given him, the one who had sold his best friend for an office and lost both, and Harry let him live it and did not visit and did not forgive, and did not pretend the not forgiving was anything other than an injury he had decided to stop calling a choice. And on the last day of the judgments, when the courtroom had emptied, Harry stood for a while in the room where they had tried him, in the place where the chair had been, and he let himself feel exactly once the full weight of the distance between the person who had sat in those chains and the one who now decided what the room was for. He had come back to rule the world that broke him, and he had done it. And the doing had cost him the forgiving and very nearly the warm room and 6 bodies he had not made on a Devon lane, and it had been worth it, and it had been terrible, and both of those were true, and he had learned from a careful man in a warm office how to hold 2 true things without letting either one become a lie. He went to Devon at the end of the first year of the new order, on an ordinary evening, because he had made a rule with himself that the work would never be the last thing of a day, and the rule had kept him human through worse than an ordinary evening. Teddy was 8 now, and his hair was whatever color the conversation called for, and he was learning to fly, badly, joyfully, on a broom Harry had given him over Andromeda's objections, and he wanted urgently to show the most powerful wizard in Britain a turn he had nearly mastered and would certainly fall off attempting. Harry watched him fall off and catch him a foot above the grass without seeming to move and set him upright, and listen with total seriousness to the child's account of how the fall had actually been part of the plan. Luna was on the cottage step with a book she was not reading, watching the two of them with her pale, certain attention, checking, as she checked every time, the temperature of the warm room. Andromeda was in the kitchen making a cake that would be terrible, and the smell of it came out across the moor, and somewhere in the country a constitution was being written that would bind the sovereign harder than the ruled, and the wagons would never run again, and the people who carried the world would not this time be broken for the carrying. "You've kept it lit," Luna said when Teddy had gone in to inspect the cake. She did not make it a question. "One night at a time," Harry said, on purpose. Against the cold, he sat down beside her on the step. "It's mostly tea in the end, you were right about that. I'm right about most things, it's terribly lonely." She leaned her head against his shoulder, briefly, the gesture of an old friend and nothing more, because she had her own life and he had his, and the thing between them had never needed to be more than this. "They'll write that you ruled them, the histories, the man who was betrayed and came back and brought the whole world to heel. That's the story. That's the one they'll tell on the channels and in the schools." "It's a true story," Harry said. "I did rule them, I do. It's a true story, Luna agreed. It's just not the important one. The important one is that there was a table in Devon and a terrible cake and a child who fell off a broom and got caught and a man who could have had anything in the world and chose every single night against everything in him that had gone to ice to come back here and be caught when he fell. She watched the last light go off the sea. Keep choosing it, Harry. That's the whole job, not the ruling. The ruling's easy for you. The job is the step and the cake and the catching. You've ruled the world that broke you. Now you just have to spend the rest of your very long life refusing to become it. Inside the cottage, a child's voice called them in for cake, and Harry Potter, who had been broken by everyone he trusted and had come back colder and vastly more powerful and done forgiving, who sat now above the whole of the world that had discarded him and held it in a hand that had learned not to close, got up off the step in the last of the light and went in and let himself be wanted by the only people who had never wanted anything from him, and kept for one more night on purpose. The single warm room that was the entire difference between the sovereign and the thing he had refused to become. Chapter 7 End.